It all started at a logistics center. The main character, Kim Jeongeum, said that Kim Sol forced him into the boxing ring with her, and that's how his personal hell began. He wrote something down in a notebook and asked maybe it would ask why he didn't leave there? There weren't many options, he had to choose the lesser of two evils. She later, of course, explained why she forced him to do it. She simply had no one to practice with except him. Isn't that funny? A robot named Pax apologized to him and said that he didn't quite understand. Could he please explain it again? Jeongeum wanted to explain, but it suddenly found an unregistered product and took it away. An MC, looking after the robot, sighed and told it to do its job. Suddenly, another robot appeared next to him and said that transportation was taking place for further assembly. Could he please step aside? The main character stepped aside and the robot, passing by, thanked him. After that, he looked around and said that there was no warmth of a human soul here at all. He looked around the work area, completely filled with drones and robots, and asked how there could be so few people in a logistics center? This was just probably not his place. It all started about 2 months ago, right after he came back from the army. But the joy of coming back was short-lived. His mother called him and said that they were moving to Ujeongbu because they found a bigger and better house. As a gift for his return, they would pay the rent for half a year in advance, so he shouldn't be upset. Jeongeum didn't understand then why they were telling him this only now. His parents suddenly moved into the main house, leaving him alone in a one-room apartment next to the school, and that's how he was forced to live alone. That's when the job search began. Finances weren't that tight, not only because his parents paid the rent, but he also contributed to his savings account while he was in the army. Because of the social support from the state for large families, he was in no hurry. But the problem was that he hoped in vain. He just lay on the bed all day and read a novel, but everything turned out not to be as rosy as in the short stories. Soon he went to get a job, but he was not accepted due to lack of experience. He had to forget about sappy romance, he was simply turned away without even a chance. The reality turned out to be much harsher. After a month of looking for a job, he began to go crazy from unbearable boredom. He continued to lie on the bed, but even this was already difficult for him, because he needed to do something. Then he decided to write to his sisters about how he was the most useless person in the world, and his second sister laughed at him, and the first asked who made him rent a one-room apartment so early. The second sister wrote that mom must have wanted to leave it to him anyway. The first sister called him a dumbass and said that he couldn't even find a part-time job, and the second agreed with her and wrote that it was time for her to go to the gym. If he had nothing to do, then he should start going to the gym too. Then suddenly a tempting offer appeared. His sister wrote that now even delivery is done by artificial intelligence, and they say that many people his age do it. It seems like there is nothing complicated about it. He was interested in this offer, and at the moment he is already working at a logistics center. He looked up at the ceiling and, watching the drones, said that there are almost no people here. He never thought that he would talk to a robot. He did not want everything to be so simple. Suddenly his colleague came up to him and called out to him. It was Manager Shin. Without taking his eyes off the documents, he said that they had run out of cans of tuna in the warehouse, but Pax sends a notification that they still have some left. Can he check if there is anything lying around there? Jeongeum agreed, and he said that he would take care of the rest then. MC put on a friendly smile and started cursing the manager in his mind, since even a robot treats him better than him. He soon reached the warehouse and went inside. The first thing he did was look around for cans of tuna and then went further, looking at all the boxes on the shelves. He finally found the right shelf and used a stepladder to take the box out, saying that it should have been on the second shelf, which is why he had to look for so long. He heard some sounds coming from the entrance and turned around, and then the door slammed shut. He immediately ran to the exit and pulled the handle a few times, but the door wouldn't budge. He got worried and dialed the manager's number and pulled the door handle a few more times and asked what kind of stupid joke was this. Were they really going to leave him here like this? Unable to get through to the manager, he said with displeasure that he always doesn't answer when he's needed. Maybe he should call the emergency services? Although this is a stupid idea, he was not locked in the freezer. Nothing serious had happened. If he called the police here, he could embarrass the manager. He decided to wait a little, but if they didn't open the door, he would still have to call. After that, he sent his second sister a photo of himself with the caption that he was locked in a warehouse, and she laughed and asked, did he say that he found a part-time job, but he was sitting in the break room? A few seconds later she wrote that she had just heard buildings collapsing near her house. He was slightly surprised, and his sister called him and he having answered the call, brought the phone to his ear, but she was silent. He thought it was a prank, but suddenly the building shook so hard that he was thrown into the air. Immediately after that, an alarm was heard and the signal lights came on. He became very worried and did not immediately understand what was going on, and then a loud announcement was heard that all employees needed to immediately leave the premises and find shelter. The message was repeated several times and 𝐥𝐸𝐻, looking at the red light of the lamp, became very nervous, after which he began to furiously knock on the door and shout that he was locked in. Realizing that there was little time, he wanted to call the emergency services, but suddenly discovered that there was no signal on the phone. He pulled the door handle again and began to worry greatly. What if a war began? But suddenly he froze in place and a loud knock was heard. 2 dents appeared on the door from the impact. He slowly removed his trembling hand from the door, and when the impact was heard again, he felt with all his gut that if he made even a sound, he would die. Strange sounds continued to be heard behind the door, and he was very scared, realizing that it was definitely a person. He fell to his knees in fear and continued to listen to what was happening outside, wondering what he should do. Some time passed. He opened the can and started eating, thinking that he had been in the warehouse for 3 days. Since no one had come for him, something serious must have happened outside. Had a war started? He may not know what had happened, but being locked in here probably saved his life. The alarm that had been working impartially since yesterday had gone silent, so he even managed to sleep normally. How long could he last here? He wondered if he would survive. He took out his phone to write down what was happening, and thought that it had little battery left. Most likely this would be his last note. He hoped that the military would open this warehouse and that his whole family would be safe. After finishing writing down his thoughts, he put the phone aside and sighed heavily, saying that sure, it was great that the alarm wasn't going off anymore, but what the hell was going on here? He hoped everyone else was okay. Suddenly, a system window appeared in front of him with a message that he had been selected. Let him test his awakened abilities. He looked up at it with a puzzled look, and the message changed. He had received the skills self-subspace of the first level. He can save any object in the subspace. One use is available. After reading the message, he smiled nervously and said that this is the end. He has gone crazy. He can't distinguish fantasy from reality. He laughed and said that in such a situation, holding out for 3 days is already impressive. So he can put any object in the subspace? Let it be the PAX Order Assembly Center. The system reported that the target was selected. Does he want to save it? He agreed, and at that moment the floor under his feet disappeared and he fell onto concrete slabs. He looked up at the sky in shock, then stood up and looked around, seeing the destroyed city around him. He noticed the overturned truck and the body of the manager lying nearby, and froze in horror. The system reported that the save was starting, and he, clutching his mouth in a fit of nausea, asked what it was, and then he vomited. The system reported that an operating system matching the specifications had been found. The update process began. MC wiped his mouth and winced, feeling a sudden pain in his head. Then he heard someone's footsteps behind him. He saw the shadow of an unknown creature next to him, and heard the sounds that were heard on the first day of his stay in the warehouse. A huge orc appeared behind him, who was in no hurry to attack, and he froze in place and nervously told himself to calm down in his thoughts. He heard exactly the same loud roar 3 days ago. It was a gorilla or a bear, whatever it wasn't leaving. He didn't care what it was, he was scared to the point of shaking. But it didn't seem to be very aggressive. At that very moment, the orc came slightly closer to him and he, unable to cope with his fear, ran away with a loud scream and began to ask for help. The orc immediately saw him as prey and growled loudly, and then rushed after him. Screaming in fear again, 𝐥𝐸𝐻 turned around and exclaimed, "What the hell is this?" While he was running, he stepped in a pool of the manager's blood and, turning around again, thought, where did the orc come from here? Why is it running after him so fast? He continued to run and thought that if this continues, he will be finished. The system reported that the synchronization is complete, he can enter the subspace. The orc is almost close to him and the system asks if he wants to enter? He nervously agreed and a red flash appeared in front of him. Then he turned around and saw the monster swinging its hand. Seeing the monster's hand coming closer, he realized that it was too late, and at that very moment the flash changed color to blue and he touched it, moving to another place. He froze in place and covered his head with his hands, ready to take the blow, but when nothing happened, he opened his eyes and saw that on the other side of the portal he just ran through, there was an orc. He asked in fear, "It won't enter here, right?" The drone that flew up to him confirmed his words and said that without his permission, no living being, object, or energy can enter or exit the subspace. MC looked up at this in surprise, and the system reported that he had entered the subspace. Still not believing what was happening, 𝐥𝐨𝐲𝐝𝐢𝐲 turned around and his eyes widened in surprise when he realized that he was in the logistics center. He looked up at the drone and, still confused by what was happening, asked, "Did he really put the entire center here?" The system reported that it was his first time entering the subspace, and received a reward for it, 1 magic stone. A magic stone immediately appeared in his hands. He looked down at this in surprise, but suddenly there was a roar behind him. The enraged monster was trying to get through the portal, but he couldn't, which made him even angrier. MC turned around nervously and asked, "Is it really not going to enter here?" The drone confirmed his words and a system window appeared in front of him, which reported that there was currently a Level 1 PAX order fulfillment center in his subspace. This is a 5-story building with a total area of 10,000 pyong, which stores all the products necessary to improve the customer's life. Delivery speed is 60 kilometers per hour. Only one delivery can be made at a time. The size limit is 2 meters. He read all the information in surprise and then asked, "Are there 2 minutes left before maintenance? Does this mean that there are 2 minutes left before the shutdown?" The drone confirmed his words and said that it can use a magic stone to supply energy and maintain objects in the subspace. At the moment, he has 1 magic stone. This is enough for 24 hours to maintain the entire object. He asked, "Is there no other way?" The drone replied that when placing the PAX order fulfillment center in the subspace, the power supply system was modified in accordance with the conditions of the subspace. The PAX order fulfillment center located in his subspace runs on magic stones. He asked in surprise, "Is this even possible?" He was still confused and wondered if he was imagining things. It felt like PAX had gotten smarter. He looked at the drone and asked where the power had gone. PAX replied that the facility's power supply had been cut off. If the power supply was cut off, PAX Fresh and most of the other products could be damaged. Remembering this, he became worried and thought that PAX Fresh was a delivery system that could store and deliver everything from fresh vegetables and meat to chilled or frozen prepared meals. The situation outside was like a war zone right now, and in this situation, food was the most important thing for survival. Now, the power to the refrigerators where the food was kept had been cut off. He said that was a problem and turned to PAX, asking if the center could last 24 hours on 1 stone, right? The drone confirmed his words and he asked how he could get more of these stones. PAX replied that he could get magic stones from otherworldly creatures. 𝐥𝐨𝐲𝐝𝐢𝐲 was left confused, and then turned his gaze to the monster that was still standing on the other side of the portal, and then handed over the magic stone to PAX and ordered to keep the center in working order. The system reported that he used 1 magic stone, and he asked if he had access to all the items in the center. The drone confirmed his words and asked what exactly he was looking for. After that, he found a huge box with a bunch of weapons and said that it could be useful. The system showed the price and name of each item and he, continuing to search for the necessary weapon, said that it would be difficult to get close to the orc to strike close. Apparently, he would have to throw knives at it. The catch is that there are not that many weapons. If he throws them around, they will quickly run out. He turned his gaze to the orc and asked, "Will these knives do at least some damage?" He took an axe out of the box and thought that until he disappears from sight, it will stand there. But he doesn't have to kill it, he'll at least give it a serious wound, and then he'll figure it out somehow. Determined that he'll succeed, he ran to the portal, and then wounded the orc's shoulder, causing it to scream loudly. MC walked away from the portal and cursed, asking, "Is it made of steel or something? And what should he do now? He just doesn't have the strength to even slightly wound it." He returned to the box and said that of the most suitable ones, there was only 1 axe, maybe he could do something. He took 1 axe out of the box and discovered that there should be 2 more, after which he turned to the robot and asked how many axes were left. PAX began to check the remaining amount of the camping axe item. While PAX was searching, he looked at the orc again and thought maybe he should just throw something heavy at it. After all, it's not a fact that he will be able to wound it with his axe. Maybe he should take a bowling ball and hit it on the knuckles? PAX said that there were 15 camping axes left. He thought that it was not that much, he would have to save the axes for later. Suddenly, he realized what the robot said and looked up at it in surprise, asking when he got this axe. There were already 15 of them? Where are all of these? After that, he went to the warehouse and, taking 1 axe, looked at the many weapons around and asked why everything was duplicated. PAX replied that the items presented here were created by converting real objects into information, therefore, they can be duplicated. Even if they are lost or broken, they will not run out. 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐬𝐿 looked up at the drone and asked, "Is there an infinite supply of everything in this center?" It confirmed his words, and he, returning to the portal, took the axe in his hands and asked, "Does this mean he does not have to rack his brains over how to use resources more economically?" Something tells him that his shoulder will fall off before he kills an orc. Pax said that he doesn't need to do it himself, he can send items automatically outside the subspace. However, the delivery is done once every 30 seconds. He can reduce the delivery time by upgrading his ability. MC clarified, "Is delivery his ability?" Pax confirmed his words and he asked how he can do it. The drone said that he needs to think of the required item and say, "Delivery," then the item will be sent automatically. He looked at the knives in the box, then said the right word, and a second later the knife pierced the orc's head at high speed, which threw it back several meters. 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐬𝐿 looked up in surprise at the drone that just threw it, and asked what the speed was. It replied that the current default delivery speed was 60 kilometers per hour. He was very surprised and asked, "So that's what the delivery speed meant?" Pax confirmed his words and said that he could adjust the speed if he wanted. Currently the speed is 75 kilometers per hour. To increase the maximum speed he needs to improve his ability. He asked how he can improve it? The drone replied that he can improve the ability with magic stones. Thinking about this, he turned his gaze to the orc, who was lying motionless near the portal, after which he turned to Pax and said that he needed some items. After that, the robot brought him everything he needed and he, taking off his work uniform, changed into more comfortable clothes suitable for the apocalypse. Throwing on a jacket, he finished changing clothes, after which he unfolded a detailed map of the capital's districts of Seoul on the floor and, taking out markers, circled the Gangnam, Yeoljiro, Dongbang and Wajongbu districts on the map. He drew an arrow showing how he would move from one district to another, and thought that since he was leaving from Gunpo, he needed to hurry if he wanted to get to his family. It would be long and difficult on foot, he was lucky that he had something to get there on. He turned his gaze to his transport, and said that of course, a car or a motorcycle would be better, but in this situation, a bicycle was fine. Sitting on a sports electric bike, he mentally addressed his family and asked them to hold on a little longer. He started moving and, having ridden through the portal and found himself on the streets of the city, he began his journey and thought that he would soon find them. 30 minutes after leaving the subspace, it had already gotten dark and he was able to kill 12 orcs. During this time and the number of monsters killed, he learned two things. The first is his ability. He heard sounds from the side and at the same moment an orc ran out at him, after which he quickly got off his bike and jumped to the side, opening a portal to the subspace. Finding himself in the logistics center, he successfully avoided the orc's attack, and it tried to get inside, but could not. He had no time to delve into the study of his ability, but after using it during the orc hunt, it turned out to be really very useful. While the orc was waiting for him at the portal, he used delivery and threw an axe at it at great speed, but it only slightly wounded it and only angered the monster, causing it to start hitting the portal in rage. MC was upset that he missed again, but it was not surprising. It is difficult to hit the target from a distance of 10 meters and with a cooldown of 30 seconds. But he can improve these indicators with the help of magic stones. In addition, Pax's capabilities are associated with more than just delivery. Hearing shuffling sounds, the orc turned around and saw an axe hovering in the air, slowly approaching the portal. There is a product return function that automatically attracts the sent item. The orc wanted to grab the axe, but something immediately hit it, and 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐬𝐿, shaking off the dust from his clothes, said that this function is also a very useful thing. He may not return ordinary items, such as axes. He has no idea how it works, but it is possible to attract magic stones. It's a pity that he can only get the stones after the monster dies. The system reported that he received 1 magic stone. At the moment he has 13 magic stones available. MC turned his gaze to Pax, who took the magic stone, and said that the return of the goods is literally the return of the sent item. He does not send magic stones, but after killing the monster, it becomes his. How does it work? He exited the portal thinking that in any case, it is good that he pulled Pax into this space. As long as the subspace is maintained, there is no risk of dying in it. Now he should quickly take the whole family here. Hearing strange sounds nearby, he froze in place and looked up at the black silhouette flying in the sky. The second thing he learned was that orcs were not the only creatures that went beyond reason. He looked closely at the monster flying in the sky and thought, what is it? This monster has wings, and it itself is larger. Killing it will not be easy. But maybe it's all just his imagination. He heard screams nearby and thought it was a bit loud in here. It seems like he's not alone. Suddenly a cry for help reached his ears and he immediately turned around excitedly. Somewhere nearby a scared man was wandering around. He was trying to run, but he didn't have enough strength. Suddenly someone called out his name 𝐵𝐴𝐴𝐽𝐻 and he turned around. Right after that a wyvern appeared above him and he screamed in fear, and the monster hit him with its tail with all its might, causing him to fall to the ground. The wyvern flew to the side and began to turn around, and the man's friend named 𝐤𝐿𝐴 ran to him and asked, "Is he okay? Let him get up quickly." But before he could run to him, a wyvern landed between them with a crash. The man froze in place and looked at the monster's sharp teeth in horror, and then met its gaze, but it immediately turned away and headed towards 𝐵𝐴𝐴𝐽𝐻. 𝐤𝐿𝐴 was left confused and wondered why it wasn't attacking him. He guessed what was going on and thought it was impossible. Was it really targeting the thinner 𝐵𝐴𝐴𝐽𝐻? His friend was getting very nervous at this point and tried to get up, but he continued to stand there and watch the wyvern, wondering if 𝐵𝐴𝐴𝐽𝐻 seemed like an easier target to it. That's why the monster wasn't interested in him. So what should he do? How can he distract it? What can he do with that tiny knife? Suddenly, a ringing sound came from behind him and he turned around in shock. 𝐥𝐴𝐲 started ringing the bell on his bike, and the man saw someone approaching them with a bright flashlight. The wyvern along with 𝐵𝐴𝐴𝐽𝐻 looked up at the stranger wondering what that sound was, and then something pierced the monster's head and blood splattered everywhere. The impact sent the wyvern flying back and it rolled on the ground raising clouds of smoke. Then it stopped and 𝐤𝐿𝐴 saw an axe in its neck. He was surprised and thought, did someone just kill that monster with an axe? A man sighed from the side and he looked at it. The MC stopped next to them and said it was good that it died with one hit. Are they okay? Realizing that he was blinding them with the light of the flashlight, he turned it off and asked if they were okay. They both looked at him dumbfounded and thought, a soldier on a bicycle? He killed the wyvern with an axe while riding a bicycle? They asked excitedly, he was a soldier, right? He was slightly surprised and the men bowed to him, thanking him for saving their lives. He replied that he was glad he could help them, but he was not a soldier. He pointed to the company logo on his jacket and said that as they could see, he was wearing a PAX FC uniform. 𝐵𝐴𝐴𝐽𝐻 asked in surprise, so he was a PAX employee? He mistook him for a soldier because of his clothes. His friend said that it didn't matter whether he was a soldier or not, he had amazing skills. Not everyone could kill a monster like that. 𝐥𝐴𝐲 said that he probably understood abilities. 𝐤𝐿𝐴 confirmed his words and said that he also had some skills awakened. Although it was just some kind of driving ability. Given the circumstances, he didn't have the chance to use it. 𝐵𝐴𝐴𝐽𝐻 laughed and said that he was a little jealous of them, he didn't have any special talents. His friend said that in any case, it was just pure luck that they were helped here. MC asked if there was really anyone here at all. 𝐵𝐴𝐽𝐻 confirmed his words and asked if he knew that this was Block C. There were logistics centers there, so many people came here initially, but besides them, various monsters had also gathered here. Most of the people who came were already dead, they were attacked and killed, and some were eaten alive. Only about 15 people were saved. The survivors are in relative isolation in Block E of the underground terminal, they also came from there. 𝐤𝐿𝐴 continued, saying that they were looking for a road that they could drive along. They also wanted to get some essential goods, but the buildings suddenly disappeared somewhere. 𝐥𝐴𝐲 became wary of their words and 𝐵𝐴𝐽𝐻 said that instead of chatting here, if he had nowhere to go, he could leave with them. They were located on the 4th underground floor of the parking lot, there are no monsters there. At least he can sleep peacefully, and they also have something to eat. MC was hesitant to answer and thought about whether he should go with them. He had hinted at transportation earlier. Does that mean they have working vehicles? He doesn't need food or a place to sleep, but he does need information, especially about functioning transportation. He doesn't completely trust them, of course, but they are taking risks too. He decided to accept their offer and thank them for their kindness, and 𝐵𝐴𝐽𝐻 laughed and replied that he saved them. It was the least they could do. They led him to their hideout, and when 𝐥𝐴𝐲 passed by the wyvern's corpse, he took the magic stone and thought that the more important thing was that they still didn't know about his ability. If something went wrong, he could just go into subspace. But he didn't think he should worry that much. When they reached the hideout, 𝐥𝐴𝐲 saw the man in front of him who had just stabbed an orc with a spear. He turned his gaze to the new arrivals and asked, "Who is this new guy?" His gaze made MC very nervous and thought that he was quite scary. 𝐵𝐴𝐽𝐻 immediately ran up to him and asked worriedly, "Is everything okay?" He replied that everything is fine, most likely this creature wandered here by accident. Lucky that the orc did not notice them, so they got off easy. No one was hurt, but this place can no longer be called safe. 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐻 looked at the corpse of the monster and nervously thought, didn't they say there were no monsters here? The man turned his attention to the MC and asked, who the hell is that? 𝐵𝐴𝐻 turned to him and replied that it was the man who saved them from the wyvern. He used to work for PAX FC, but he is quite strong. He managed to kill the monster with an axe, and not a wet spot was left on the creature's head. After listening to him, all the other people were surprised and someone asked what kind of ability he had. Suddenly, someone's threatening footsteps were heard from the left of 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐻. He turned his gaze to the man who was approaching him, and then the woman grabbed his hands with a big smile on her face and said that he saved Yongsu and 𝐵𝐴𝐻. The other man thanked him for his help, and the woman said that she didn't even know how to thank him. He waved his hand and replied that he just did what he had to. The woman was happy and said he was so kind, then laughed and asked if he had a girlfriend. Yongsu took the woman away from 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐻 and told her to stop talking nonsense, and the menacing man laughed and walked up to 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐻, saying that he might be a little surprised, but to let him explain everything. They have been working together for 10 years, Yongsu and 𝐵𝐴𝐻 are family members. It is nice to meet him. His name is Lee Ji-mak, he is the general manager of Daecheon Express Terminal. He bowed and thanked him for saving them, and the MC was a little confused and said his name. The man said that he can feel at home here. Even if this place is not 100% safe, it is still better than the surface. They have food and water from the logistics center. If he wants, he can eat. Or he can sleep peacefully while they are on duty. He can eat as much as he wants, he shouldn't worry about it. They have a lot of supplies, and even if they run out, they'll just take more. Yongsu suddenly called out to him excitedly, and said that he had something he wanted to tell him. The logistics center just disappeared. The underground parking lot was silent for a few seconds, and then everyone started whispering in confusion, discussing this. The manager turned his gaze to 𝐵𝐴𝐻 and asked in surprise, what do you mean the logistics center disappeared? He replied that they were serious, it literally disappeared. They decided to look around and came across a monster. One of the men exclaimed that this was impossible. How could something like this ever happen? How could such a huge building just disappear? The manager calmed down and said that with monsters walking around, it was impossible to stay like this on their days. 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐻 nervously rubbed his neck and someone asked what they should do now. 𝐺-mak said that they had to clear the tunnel at all costs. If they stayed here, it would only get worse. They shouldn't despair, it was just that their time had come a little early. They had to clear the tunnel as soon as possible. The woman supported him and confidently clenched her hand into a fist, saying that they were going to have to leave someday anyway. They could do it. Everyone else agreed with the manager's decision, and at that time, MC approached him and asked what he meant by clearing the tunnel. He replied that he might have heard from Yongsu and 𝐵𝐴𝐻 that they all lived in different places, which was why they needed transportation to get there. He asked if they had any working cars. 𝐺-mak confirmed his words and said that they had plenty, but the only problem was that all the roads were blocked. The road to the north was blocked by a golf course, the east direction was littered with containers, and the southern Yangdang Expressway was destroyed. The tunnel to the west is the only option, but a flock of wyverns has taken up residence there. Until today, they have been living on the food from the logistics center, but now they will have to force their way in. From his words, 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐻 understood that they have transportation, but they will have to clear the tunnel to use it. The manager said that he doesn't have to go with them, all the blocked roads are for transportation, and he can leave this place by another route with a bicycle. He replied that since he needs normal transportation, he should help them. He thought that if the tunnel is inhabited only by wyverns, that would be great. It will take some time, but he will be able to destroy them with his ability. 𝐺-mak laughed and said that he wants to go with them, but he is trying to dissuade him, he likes his attitude. MC smiled in response, and said that if he can help, he will do everything necessary. His face instantly became serious, and he thought that he cannot show them his ability. They may seem kind, but he cannot let his guard down. They, unlike him, were unlucky enough to be in a safe place. They had been fighting for their lives the whole time he was locked up. They had supplies in the logistics center, but they wouldn't say how much there was, they knew the price of food and water. It's not information they could easily share with others. And rightly so, he should be just as careful. He said that if they didn't mind, he would go see what was going on with the tunnel, and how many creatures were breeding there. He figured that he could use his ability alone to clear the way, and maybe he could improve some of the features that were unlocked after killing the orc. For example, with 5 magic stones he could reduce the recharge time to 5 seconds, and for more stones he could purchase the ability to accurately deliver when selecting a specific target. For 10 magic stones, he could get the ability to send 2 items at once, as well as purchase automatic delivery of selected items and speed it up. When the system told him about these improvements, he didn't quite understand the point of automatic delivery, but the rest of the features were incredibly good. For such a great ability, he only needs 10 magic stones. He is glad that he did not use them all at once. If he encounters a pack of monsters, he can improve something. Taking advantage of their caution, he said that he will go alone to calmly kill all the monsters and get the stones, and then improve his ability to clear the way. But contrary to his expectations, he was sent into the tunnel with 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐠. 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐸𝐬 sat in the luggage seat, and 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐠 took the steering wheel. He turned to him and said that it was dangerous to go here alone. He replied that it was okay, it was not him that the monster was chasing back then. 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐠 replied that this is different, he can't let it go, besides, he doesn't know the way. And he believes that he can save them if something happens. MC was surprised and thanked him for his trust, and then asked, so this is his first time using his ability, right? Does he see the status window and everything? He replied that he hadn't seen it since he awakened his ability, but he had an idea of how he should drive. His words made 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐸𝐬 nervous and said that he could try, and if that didn't work, they would just walk. Soon, they were driving out onto the city streets at high speed, and the MC, clearly nervous about his driving style, looked at the pose he had taken and asked in surprise, what was that? Why was he driving like that? 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐠 replied that there were too many cars on the road, it was hard to see them. 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐸𝐬 was scared and thought he was completely crazy, and then suddenly the man said that there was a wyvern ahead. What should they do? The MC tried to see what was ahead, but he couldn't see anything because of 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐠, and he nervously asked if they should continue driving. 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐸𝐬 asked him to wait and said that he couldn't see anything, after which he finally saw a dark silhouette among the cars in it, hearing the sounds, looked at them. 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐠 turned to him in fear and asked what he should do. Should he continue driving or stop? MC sternly ordered him to look ahead, after which something hit the wyvern and it immediately lost its balance. They passed by the monster and 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐸𝐬 turned around, watching as its corpse fell. Pulling the magic stone towards himself, he told 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐠 not to dare look back, and he listened to him, after which they drove on. After a while, 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐠 said that he could already see the tunnel and 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐸𝐬 looked ahead, saying that it was closer than he thought. Suddenly, 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐠 abruptly braked and they stopped, after which MC asked in confusion why he suddenly stopped. He flinched, hearing sounds behind him, and 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐠 became very nervous and said that things seemed really bad. They both looked around and saw that they were surrounded by a whole flock of wyverns. One of them slowly walked towards them and started making sounds, and 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐠 froze in horror and thought that this was the end. Even with an electric bike, they couldn't escape from so many monsters. They simply wouldn't have time to get to a safe place, so he could only hope for 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐸𝐬's ability, otherwise they were finished. He trembled with fear and suddenly 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐸𝐬's voice was heard behind him. He cursed and opening the system window, said that he couldn't hide it anymore. After that, he turned to Pax and used 5 stones to reduce the recharge time. 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐠 turned around and asked in surprise, what the hell is he doing now? At that very moment, one of the wyverns screamed loudly, signaling the others, and several monsters rushed at them. Seeing the wyvern's mouth approaching, 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐠 trembled in fear and cursed silently, and then suddenly heard the word, delivery, behind him and immediately ducked, and something flew above him at high speed and pierced the wyvern. He closed his eyes in fear and covered his head with his hands, and a few seconds later, 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐸𝐬 said that everything was fine now. He turned around, about to ask what happened, but fell silent mid-sentence when he saw a portal to the logistics center behind him. At this time, MC used several magic stones to reduce the delivery cooldown to 5 seconds, and the drone said that in order to reduce the cooldown further, he needed to increase the subspace level. 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐠 was still looking at him in surprise, then Pax picked up some rocks from the wyverns that had just died and 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐸𝐬 looked around, took out an axe and told 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐠 not to leave his side from now on. That was the only way he could protect him. Did he understand? He nervously agreed and thought, what is with Pax and the logistics center? MC suddenly warned him of the danger and he turned around, seeing a wyvern flying straight at him with a loud scream. But 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐸𝐬 immediately attacked it with an axe and it was thrown back a few meters, after which the other wyverns screamed and decided to attack. One of them headed towards 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐠 and he, not knowing what to do, froze in place, and the portal behind him began to disappear. A moment before the impact, the portal appeared in front of him, thereby protecting him from the wyvern, and it collided with the barrier, and because of this it lost one of its teeth. 𝐤𝐸 was very scared, and when the portal grew, it pushed him away and he fell to the ground along with the monster. At that very moment, another wyvern appeared above them and screamed, announcing its presence, but MC quickly reacted and threw a weapon at it. The wyvern was able to dodge and headed towards him, making loud sounds, and 𝐤𝐸 was very scared for 𝐥𝐸𝐲, but at that time he jumped into the portal and the monster hit the barrier, wondering what was going on. Something sharp immediately flew into its face and it was thrown back, and 𝐤𝐸 froze, surprised to watch 𝐥𝐸𝐲 deal with the monsters. He came out of the portal and he thought that this was simply incredible. From the PAX Logistics Center to a pair of axes. He does not quite understand what happened, but he is sure of one thing. For 𝐥𝐸𝐲, these monsters are not a problem. He will cope with the release of the tunnel without any difficulty. With the help of a car, in the current situation, you can get to the right place relatively quickly and safely. The tunnel is only a part of the route, the monsters outside it will not go anywhere anyway. But for 𝐥𝐸𝐲 it is different, he needs a car only as a means of transportation. He envies him, with such an ability, he could quickly get to his family. But how far does he have to go, if he needs a car? At this moment, 𝐥𝐸𝐲 noticed something surprising. The remaining wyverns decided not to attack and simply flew away. Following the monsters with his eyes, 𝐤𝐸 said that it seems they considered him dangerous. He replied that reptiles are much smarter than they look, after which he thought that he wanted to improve the accuracy of delivery, but he is a little short of magic stones. 𝐤𝐸 noticed how he picks up one of the stones and asked what it is. MC was slightly surprised by his question and asked if this is the first time he sees a magic stone. 𝐤𝐸 was surprised by the name of this stone, and he explained that it is needed to improve the ability. 𝐤𝐸 stood up, brushing the dust off his clothes and asked, so they could improve their abilities? He would try it sometime if he had the chance. MC agreed with him and thought that now he understood why he didn't take the stone from that orc. Maybe their abilities work differently? 𝐤𝐸 said that to be honest, he didn't expect that he had such an ability. Pax throws axes like a gun. With that kind of strength, he would probably be able to kill all the monsters? 𝐥𝐸𝐲 smiled wryly and remained silent, and the man asked in surprise he would be able to do that, right? He replied that to be honest, he just wanted to inspect the tunnel, but if he was lucky, he would quickly deal with everyone. And he wasn't eager to show off his abilities to everyone. 𝐤𝐸 stared at him in surprise, then bowed slightly and apologized, saying that he had ruined all his plans. He replied that it was fine, he didn't know the way, so if he had gone alone, he wouldn't have made it here at all. He turned around and suggested that they go back. The wyverns had retreated for now, but they could come back and attack again. He headed for his bike and 𝐤𝐸 asked how far he had to go if he needed a car. He replied that he would go to where his family was. The nearest stop was Gangnam, and the final destination was Ujeongbu. 𝐤𝐸 imagined how his route would be and excitedly said that he needed to go to Indaekwon, which was right on the way to Gangnam. He looked down and pursed his lips, then hesitantly asked if it was okay if he could come with him. 𝐥𝐸𝐲 was slightly surprised by his question, and he said that even if he got out through the tunnel, he wasn't sure he would be able to get home safely. He knew that his ability was related to driving. He's a good driver, but he's not much of a fighter. But he can fight monsters, and since they're on the same route, they can join forces. Gangnam isn't close, but he can get him to Indaekwon faster than anyone else. He may not be as much of a help as him, but he promises he won't be extra baggage. He also has some food supplies. MC thought it was a good idea. His driving skills are beyond doubt, but more importantly, will he be able to hide his abilities from the others? If they find out, he doesn't even know how they'll react. Maybe he's worrying too much about it. What if they force him to do something he doesn't want to do? The best way to avoid unnecessary fuss is to keep everything a secret. He seems to trust 𝐤𝐸. Even though they were being chased by a monster just now, he still decided to risk his life by going with it. He agreed and 𝐤𝐸 thanked him with a big smile on his face, but 𝐥𝐸𝐲 made one condition. He would clear the tunnel alone, the others might interfere with him, and he also didn't want them to know about his ability. So let him make it so no one interferes. Let him talk to everyone for him. The man confidently hit his chest and told him not to worry, they wouldn't be stubborn if he asked them to. Once they got back to the parking lot, he gathered everyone and said with a smile that they would all be able to get out of here through the tunnel. He pointed to 𝐥𝐸𝐲 standing behind him and said that he would clear the tunnel with his awakened ability, and they should wait outside until he was done. They were probably wondering what his ability was, but it was a secret. Let them just trust that he could handle it. The MC looked at him confused and thought that this was just unthinkable. How could he tell everyone about this? Someone asked if 𝐥𝐸𝐲 would clear the tunnel alone, and they should just wait for him to finish? Could he tell them how he was going to do it? Yongsu confirmed his words and MC thought he was done for. They were already wary of him, and now he was saying all sorts of things that could further undermine their trust. 𝐺𝐸𝐼 stepped forward with a serious look and 𝐥𝐸𝐲 wondered what he should do now. But it was too late to back out, so he could only go forward. He nervously said that he would clear the tunnel by tomorrow morning so everyone could pass. He looked at the people who started discussing it among themselves and thought that it sounded lame, but there were no other options. They were probably running out of supplies, so they needed to get the tunnel sorted out soon. At least that way they would be less worried. Suddenly the manager called out to him, and he flinched, and he said that he would not ask about his abilities because he did not see any point in it. Maybe he decided to do this out of sympathy for them. If it was easier for him without them, they would not interfere. He pointed to the man who put the box of supplies on the floor and said that while he was in the tunnel, they had collected some supplies here so that he could have a snack. He risked his life for all of them, and all they could do was share the food. Now he was going to clear the tunnel alone. They were very grateful to him. MC became worried because he clearly did not expect this from them, after which all the people bowed their heads in front of him, and the manager said that they were sorry, that all they could offer was their gratitude. He was confused and replied that he did it because it was necessary, so they should not do this. This food was probably saved for their family, so they should keep it all for themselves. Yongsu put his hand on his shoulder and told him to just accept it. Giving away the last of his food isn't easy, so he might offend everyone by refusing. And besides, they're not the only ones with families, he has relatives out there somewhere too. 𝐺𝐸𝐼 looked at him in surprise and remembered his family, and someone approached the manager and asked, "So the tunnel will be clear by tomorrow morning and they'll finally get out of here?" He confirmed his words, after which the man happily told the others to open the hiding place and drag the booze here. It's time for them to celebrate. 𝐺𝐸𝐼 took a bottle of alcohol and said that it was a pity that there was so little booze, but maybe it was for the best. They would drink as much as they needed and then head off to their families tomorrow. The man raised his glass and suggested that everyone drink to their safe arrival and the safety of their families, as well as to 𝐺𝐸𝐼. They all drank, and the next morning the MC set off. The people walked him to the tunnel, and as he climbed on his bike, he turned to them and told them not to worry, everything would be fine. They remained silent, looking at him with concern, after which he put his feet on the pedals and went into the tunnel, but at the end, with a serious expression on his face, he said that he would be back. He rode past several cars and, skirting the holes, stopped at the tunnel, and the wyverns, noticing the man, began to growl. He looked at the whole flock that was hiding in the darkness, and remembered a moment from his childhood. His father asked, "Did the two of them quarrel again?" He pointed his finger at his sister 𝐸𝐲 and replied that she started it first, she always finds fault with him. She exclaimed in response, "When did this happen?" They started arguing again, and their father said that they had quarreled so many times already and again. He suddenly smiled and said that despite this, they were still close. The kids stopped fighting and looked at him with confusion, and he said that he was an only child in the family, so he always envied the bond between brothers and sisters. So they can't even imagine how jealous he is of both of them now. Even though they may hate each other now, but the day will come when they will understand how valuable and important family is. He wanted to say something else, but suddenly his wife hit him on the back of the head with a ladle and exclaimed displeasedly, "Didn't she ask him to help her with dinner?" She kept wondering why he was taking so long, and he was just sitting there. They continued to argue, and 𝐺𝐸𝐼, watching them, smiled. When he was drinking with the others yesterday, their behavior caused him exactly the same feelings. The manager burst into tears from the alcohol and began to remember his son, and the man said displeasedly that he started doing that again. Let someone take the bottle away from him. The rest of the people laughed, and the MC, after watching them for a while, began to smile. Soon, the parking lot finally became quiet and everyone went to bed. Yongsu woke up in the middle of the night and felt thirsty, but suddenly discovered that 𝐺𝐸𝐼 was nowhere to be found. He went outside and asked the attendants where he was, and they replied that he had gone out to get some air a while ago. Maybe he was uncomfortable. He ran out to the parking lot where the trucks were parked and looked around, then froze, noticing 𝐺𝐸𝐼 carrying boxes into the truck. He ran up to him and said that he must be tired. Why isn't he sleeping? Maybe he's uncomfortable there? He replied that it wasn't that, he just couldn't sleep. Yongsu wondered what he was doing and looked into the cargo hold of the truck, but suddenly his eyes widened in surprise when he saw a bunch of boxes with supplies inside. MC said that he didn't load the truck completely to make it easier to drive, but this should be enough. This is the last truck. Yongsu repeated in surprise, the last truck? He means he filled 15 trucks with so many things? 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐬𝐿 asked him not to tell anyone about this, and he exclaimed that even though he had a pack center on hand, he loaded too many supplies. He replied that it was fine, there were quite a lot of goods in the warehouse. Yongsu looked at him in surprise and thought that even if that was the case, he shouldn't throw food around. Who is he? While MC was lost in memories of the previous night, he had already started fighting the monsters and was able to finish off several. He created a portal in the tunnel and now the monsters couldn't even get close to him. He immediately killed them. Standing calmly in the logistics center, he watched the wyvern corpses fall to the ground and thought that he wanted to put all these people in the subspace. But when he asked Pax about it, the robot replied that at the current level, it was impossible. If he upgraded the subspace to level 2, he would be able to place up to 20 people here. To upgrade the subspace level, 100 magic stones are needed. Looking at the system window, 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐬𝐿 looked up at the flock of monsters and thought that there were at most 40 wyverns left. Some flew away 1 or 2 at a time, so it was unlikely that he would be able to upgrade the level. But thanks to the precision delivery upgrade, he managed to finish off quite a lot of the lizards. Without it would have been less. If he wanted to settle his family in the subspace, then he needed to upgrade the level. He suddenly noticed one wyvern among the rest that was different, who was just sitting and watching everything from afar. This alerted him, and he frowned. Some time passed and the people continued to wait for him, and the woman asked worriedly, "Is 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐬𝐿 okay?" The man replied that if they tried to help, they could only make things worse. They just needed to wait a little longer. Suddenly, one of them noticed some movement and told the others to look, he was coming back. The MC came out of the tunnel and walked towards them, and his clothes were completely covered in blood spatter. Noticing this, the people became worried, but seeing the smile on his face, they immediately became happy and ran towards him. After that, the manager gathered everyone around him and said that they had all worked hard under an incompetent manager like him. He hoped they would all get home safe and sound. Yongsu thanked him for everything and said that they also hoped he would get home safely. 𝐥𝐸𝐿 smiled in response, and 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐬𝐿 said that if they had any problems along the way, they should look in the cargo hold. He left a small gift there, he thinks they will like it. Yongsu smiled and everyone else looked at him in surprise, then took the trucks and set off. Skirting abandoned cars on the road, they drove into a tunnel and soon successfully drove out of there. They said goodbye to each other and went their separate ways, going to look for their relatives. While they were driving, MC looked out the window and looked at the sky, thinking, what kind of wyvern was that? It disappeared so quickly that he did not have time to see it properly. He is almost sure that it was a wyvern, but it looked different, and it was bigger in size. Maybe it was a leader or an adult? He was suddenly distracted from his thoughts, hearing a strange sound, and looked out the window, finding that they were already driving in the middle of houses and running over the corpses of people and monsters. Yongsu's face darkened and 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐬𝐿 looked at him and thought that they had no choice. There were corpses of the dead scattered everywhere, bodies of monsters, and overturned cars. There was no normal road. But this happened everywhere they went. Yongsu might be having an even harder time. However, the fact that the soldiers' bodies were left lying like this on the streets meant that the situation was worse than they thought. He looked at the wyvern that was currently tearing apart someone's corpse, and thought that if he had returned from the army 3 months later, he could have been among them too. Yongsu suddenly stopped the car and called out to him, saying that the road was blocked. In front of them was a fence with barbed wire, behind which were several overturned cars. Yongsu said that the barbed wire seemed to have been installed by the military. He had the feeling that they were trying to fence themselves off from something. They would have to go another way, there should be another bridge they could cross. But MC didn't let him finish and asked him to wait a minute. There's something at the end of the bridge. He noticed the dog-like monsters wandering along the road. M said that he thought he saw what they were trying to barricade themselves from. How many of them were there? He thought if he killed those creatures, maybe he could improve the subspace. Yongsu got nervous and said that he was turning around. There must be another route they could use. MC remained silent and looked to the side. He noticed a sidewalk nearby that was completely free, and thought maybe they should try to get through there. He asked Yongsu to wait and asked if they could drive on that sidewalk. He confirmed his words and said that the road was a bit narrow, but there was a chance. Realizing that he still wanted to drive onto the road with the monsters, 𝐤𝐸𝐲 asked him to wait. But 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐬 didn't let him finish and said that he had thought of a good way to drive, so he shouldn't turn the car around. He looked at him with a smile and said that they would go here. Hearing strange sounds, 𝐤𝐸𝐲 turned his gaze to the bridge and saw a huge orc that grabbed a dog and began to wave it, making loud sounds. The other dogs immediately pounced on him and attacked, and then knocked him to the ground and mauled him to death. Watching them quickly dispatch the orc, 𝐤𝐸𝐲 became very nervous and asked 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐬 the idea he was talking about. He understood him correctly, right? He wants to drive on that bridge? He calmly confirmed his words and asked if he had ever heard of a game where 3 races wage war on each other. It's a strategy game called Stark. He confirmed his words and added that there was no one his age who hadn't heard of it. MC said that in this game, there was the ability to customize maps and additional options to your liking. His favorite map was the one where you had to fight off hordes of monsters using a limited amount of resources. It turned out that the current situation reminded him very much of that map. His words made 𝐤𝐸𝐲 nervous, and he asked if he could turn the cargo hold towards the fence. After this, 𝐤𝐸𝐲 turned the truck around and drove onto the sidewalk, then put it into reverse and knocked out the fence, which threw part of it back with a loud crash. Hearing the sound, the monsters immediately turned their attention to them, and 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐬 went outside and, moving to the cargo compartment, opened the system window and said that he, of course, wanted to try it, but he didn't think that everything would go like this. The system reported that he unlocked automatic delivery by using 10 magic stones. At the moment, he has 27 stones. Watching the dogs approach, MC ordered Pax to spend everything on improving his characteristics, after which he crouched down and the system reported that 5 magic stones were spent on increasing the delivery speed to 100 km per hour. Opening a portal behind his back, he called the dogs to him with a smile and said that if they had eaten their fill, then let them come to him, it was time to play. Immediately after he said that, the dogs rushed to attack, and he summoned a double-door refrigerator and threw it at them at high speed, and then summoned several more, crushing several monsters, for which he received 12 magic stones. Calmly standing in place, he crossed his arms over his chest and said that this was not bad. It was not for nothing that he improved the delivery range and its accuracy after clearing the tunnel. He could have simply thrown an axe. The precision delivery speed was also improved, but after using it, he realized that precision delivery could not track the change in the target's route. The delivery direction was adjusted only slightly, and these dogs were incredibly fast. Even if he threw the axe at 100 km per hour, the creatures behind him would be able to dodge. And on top of that, they did not stop attacking even when they saw their relatives die. Given the current situation, the optimal delivery interval was currently 2.5 seconds, so he had better do just that. He threw the refrigerator at the monsters again, thinking that it was something they wouldn't be able to dodge, and it was not only big, but also heavy, so it would knock the dogs down quite easily. Plus, thanks to the automatic delivery he had just perfected, the process had become more convenient. Several magic stones flew into the portal, and he yawned widely, thinking that he might not even have to watch the fight. He told Pax to keep it up, and suddenly one of the dogs let out a loud bark, but then there was a crash. It had knocked over the refrigerator at high speed. Watching everything through the rearview mirror, 𝐤𝐸𝐲 was horrified and wondered what that was. Did he throw the refrigerator? He thought he could only throw axes. Plus, he had a feeling that the items flying out of the truck were the same. Even if it was a logistics center, what was the point of only keeping one type of product? Maybe the items would somehow reappear there? He collected the axes back then and reused them, but he doesn't regret the refrigerators. What's going on? 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐬 looked into the truck's cabin and asked if he wanted something to eat. 𝐤𝐸𝐲 said his name nervously and he calmly asked, "What's wrong?" He looked at him with a surprised look and asked if his supply was endless. The MC looked at him in confusion and then asked, "Didn't he know that?" The man replied in confusion that he thought he collected the axes because he didn't have many of them, but it seemed like he had quite a lot. He climbed inside and said that wasn't the case. If he didn't take the axes back, they would just be lying around on the road and could hurt someone. Maybe he just got it all wrong. 𝐤𝐸𝐲 asked, "Then is it true that the supply is endless?" He confirmed his words and he cursed in shock, and 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐬 asked, "So what does he want?" He replied that he would rather have a sugar-free cola and a donut right now. The MC took out some food from the portal and handed it to 𝐤𝐸𝐲, who said that he was ashamed anyway. He didn't even know what his powers were, and he was sharing his food with him. He replied that it was okay and started chewing on the donut with a smile, then thanked him for trusting him. He was very grateful. If he needed anything, he should let him know. He had everything he needed. The man laughed and thanked him, saying that it was okay. Thanks to him destroying the monsters, he would be back home soon. If they crossed the bridge, it would only be an hour's drive. 𝐥𝐸𝐲 was happy and said that he would see his family very soon. He smiled slightly and confirmed his words, saying that he just hoped that nothing happened to them and to him too. The MC smiled and noticed his clothes and said that he couldn't show them to his family like that. After his words, Young-soo noticed his clothes and his comrade said that he thought it would take time to sort everything out, so they could find him something new for now. Maybe he had any preferences? He laughed and said that he even helps him with his clothes. He thanked him and said with a smile that he wasn't quite sure that he had what he usually wears. But he still found Young-soo's clothes that suited him, and he threw on a cool jacket and sunglasses. 𝐥𝐸𝐲 looked in the rearview mirror and said that almost all the problems were solved, only minor things remained. His comrade decided that it was time to move out, and skillfully shifting gears, abruptly hit the pedal, causing the wheels to squeal. The truck drove across the bridge in reverse at high speed and the MC, trying to hold on, grabbed the handle above the door and looked out the window. The truck hit some dogs on the sidewalk and crossed the bridge, and then Young-soo shifted the gear and spun the steering wheel, telling 𝐥𝐸𝐲 to hold on tight. They will be there in 20 minutes. They drove onto the road and the car spun sharply, causing the MC to almost fall out of the window, and then they drove on. Soon the truck finally stopped and 𝐥𝐸𝐲, almost dying, asked Young-soo to slow down and said that he was going to throw up. At this time, he lowered his glasses and worriedly looked at the building, saying that they had arrived. The MC turned his gaze out the window and saw a dilapidated 5-story building nearby. After that, they got out of the truck and Young-soo, getting closer, began to convince himself that the reason the building was in bad shape was because it was just old. The surrounding buildings were exactly the same. In general, this area was long overdue for restoration. Only ruins of buildings remained here. There were no corpses nearby. This place was completely different from the street where bodies were lying underfoot. They went up to the right floor and he, approaching his apartment, reached out with a trembling hand to the door handle and thought that his family was okay. He just needed to enter the password to open the door and enter. He continued to convince himself that everything was okay, but his fear was so strong that he did not dare to open it. Noticing this, 𝐥𝐸𝐲 thought that he pressed the gas pedal so hard that they got here in 15 minutes, although the journey usually takes an hour. That's how much he hurried to see his family. He drove so fast just to see them, but if there were only dead people inside, it would be bad. No matter what, he wouldn't be able to open that door. He imagined himself in his place and touched his shoulder, asking if he should ring the doorbell instead. Young-soo turned around and looked at him dumbfoundedly, then looked down and agreed. After that, the MC stepped forward with the thought that no one wants to confirm their family's death, even if the probability is small. If it were him, he would want someone else to open the door. Otherwise, he would rather not know the truth. When he got to the door, he turned to Young-soo and told him to get ready, and Young-soo hung his head dejectedly and agreed, then began to ask for everything to be okay with his family. But before 𝐥𝐸𝐲 could ring the doorbell, the door itself opened, and they looked inside in surprise. Young-soo's eyes widened when he saw his wife and daughter in front of him, looking at him in surprise. His wife, 𝐥𝐸𝐲, with tears in her eyes, opened the door wider and asked, "Is it really him?" He burst into tears of happiness, and immediately rushed to them, hugging them tightly. The MC, who already had bruises under his eyes, began to watch them with a smile, and his comrade, still not believing what was happening, asked his wife how she knew to open the door. She replied that she heard sounds and looked through the peephole, and when she saw that it was him standing on the other side, she opened it. He was very happy that they were safe, and his daughter Yoo-jong, clutching his clothes, burst into tears and told him not to leave them anymore. 𝐥𝐸𝐲 turned her attention to 𝐥𝐸𝐲 and asked who was with him. He replied that he was a benefactor who helped him get here safely. Suddenly, 𝐥𝐸𝐲's eyes began to close and he lost his balance and fell to the floor. Young-soo called out to him worriedly, but he did not respond and just stared at one point. His eyes began to slowly close and he thought that he should not sleep here, after which he slightly opened his eyes and, seeing Young-soo's blurry silhouette in front of him, he could no longer resist. He fell asleep and remembered a moment from his childhood. They were sitting at a funeral and he asked his father why he was not crying. He turned to him with a smile and replied that parting doesn't always bring only sadness. The more time they spend together, the more affection, gratitude, regret, and longing they feel. So the moment of parting doesn't necessarily have to be sad. And he rather feels gratitude. MC looked up at him with a surprised look, and he said that he feels gratitude because he has experienced true love. It's hard to understand, but someday, when he grows up and learns that love isn't easy to give or receive. His memory suddenly changed to Seol hitting him in the face with a pillow, causing him to fall to the floor. With a bruise covering his entire eye, he suddenly stood up and screamed, asking why she was hitting him. She called him an idiot and asked in confusion what he was even talking about. She put a pillow under her to make it soft. Little 𝐥𝐸𝐲 exclaimed that he hated her, then ran to his father and said that he would tell him everything. His sister victoriously raised a pillow above her head and said that Kim 𝐥𝐸𝐲 was losing and Kim Seol had once again defended her championship. They continued to fight and their father talked about how important family is. Then his wife hit him with a ladle, indignant that he didn't help her cook. When everything was finally ready, they all gathered at one table and their mother called out to 𝐥𝐸𝐲, telling her to put her phone away and come eat. The girl sat down at the table and her mother asked if she liked some boy. She had been on her phone a lot lately. She replied that she was in middle school and all her friends communicated via text messages now. Seol turned to the TV, watching the boxers with admiration, and her sister asked if she watched the fights. The MC looked at the fight and made a face, saying that it must have hurt. Their mother sat at the table and said that they all watch TV all the time, but she can't even watch TV shows. Her eldest son approached Seol and asked if she would go to middle school next year. She confirmed his words and he said that maybe there was a boxing club or a sports club there, let her try to enroll there. He thought she would succeed. She smiled confidently, and said that only because of this she decided on the school. Listening to their conversation, 𝐥𝐸𝐲 was surprised and thought about it, and when he grew up a little, he finally transferred to middle school. He froze in front of the school gate and looked at the welcoming poster, after which he paid attention to the other students, especially their beautiful and new uniforms. Then he turned his gaze to his uniform. It looked worn out and was clearly not his size, but he was so happy about his admission to the school that he was not upset at all. Soon, school bullying began. He and another boy were driven into an alley by other students and began to beat them up, not sparing him at all. One of them wanted to punch him, but suddenly someone grabbed his wrist and he turned around, seeing a large-built girl behind him. It was 𝐥𝐸𝐲's older sister, Seol. She looked at the bully with indifference, then turned her gaze to her brother, who was happy to see her, and said that this would not do. From now on he would study with her in the mornings. These words sounded like a sentence to him. Now every morning he was forced to endure her hellish training, but thanks to this, he and his friends were no longer the target of school bullies. Time passed quickly and soon 𝐥𝐸𝐲 received a letter of acceptance to the university, and informed her family about it. She smiled proudly and her father, showing the phone to his children, exclaimed with delight that their sister was admitted to medical school. Seol and 𝐥𝐸𝐲, who were playing together, simultaneously exclaimed that they could not believe it. Soon the MC grew up and his father said with a smile that it looks like it finally arrived. 𝐥𝐸𝐲 turned around and saw a letter in his hand, and when he opened it and read it, he froze in horror. It was a notice of enlistment for military service. Soon after receiving the letter, he went to the army and almost his entire family came out to see him off, and his sister laughed really hard at his new hairstyle. Despite this, he kept a straight face and his mother worriedly told him to take care of himself and not lose heart. He joined the rest of the boys and waved goodbye to her, and then went to the military unit. His family said goodbye to him again, and he decided not to turn around so as not to show them his tears. The long dream of his life finally ended, and he opened his eyes, finding himself on a soft bed. He stood up abruptly and began to nervously look around, wondering what this place was. Had he fainted? He clearly remembers Young-soo meeting his family, but that's his last memory. He became wary and immediately pulled out an axe from the subspace, after which 𝐥𝐸𝐲's voice was heard behind him, asking if he was awake. He turned around in fear and saw his comrade's wife and her daughter in front of him, calmly eating and watching him in surprise. He looked around again, and then heard snoring behind him and turned around, seeing Young-soo sleeping nearby. 𝐥𝐸𝐲 asked how he was feeling. He suddenly fainted, and then immediately fell asleep. He slept so well that they didn't wake him up. 𝐥𝐸𝐲 remained silent and looked down at the axe in his hand, then threw it into the portal and asked how long he slept. She replied that it wasn't that long, about 3 hours. She smiled and said that her husband told her everything. He helped him get here, for which she is very grateful to him, because now they were able to reunite. She bowed to him, and he excitedly waved his hand, saying that she does not need to thank him. he also helped him a lot. At that moment, Yongsu woke up and said that compared to the help he received, he can't say that he helped him in any way. He got up and added that he saved his life. His wife said that they must be hungry, so let them eat first and then talk. She turned her gaze to 𝐥𝐸𝐲 and said that her husband insisted on eating with him, so he hadn't eaten anything until now. Yongsu smiled at 𝐥𝐸𝐲 and offered him something to eat, and he happily agreed. After that, 𝐥𝐸 put many plates with different dishes on the table, and the MC, looking at the food in front of him, wondered in surprise, "Is this stewed sorry?" She said that she wasn't sure if he would like this dish. She would have loved to cook something else, but she didn't have the necessary ingredients. He thanked her and said that there was no dish more luxurious than this, after which she took her daughter to another room and said that they had already eaten, so he shouldn't worry and enjoy his dinner. They went to another room and closed the door behind them, and he thought that they didn't have to go that far. Yongsu wished him bon appetit and he started eating, after which he scooped up a piece of fish with a spoon and tasted it, which delighted him. He thought it was incredible. He felt a whole surge of emotions. On the tip of his tongue, he tasted a real feast of flavors. How did she manage to balance the sweet and oily taste of deep-fried kimchi? The savory taste of regular sari and kimchi remains in his mouth. No wonder this dish makes him feel cozy. After finishing his meal, he put the spoon down and said that it was very tasty, after which he became a little upset and thought that since the chaos in the world, or rather since he came back from the army, of the dishes he had eaten in the past 3 months, this was the most delicious. It's on par with the kimchi stew that his mother makes. Yongsu asked. He said that he was going to Gangnam, right? He confirmed his words and added that he would stop there first. The man confidently said that he would give him a ride, which surprised the MC, and then he said that he talked to his wife. When he told her that he was going to find his family, she asked, "Are they the only family that matters?" 𝐥𝐸𝐲 became worried and asked him to wait. Gangnam is not his final destination. He plans to go to Ujeongbu, so he needs a car. Yongsu replied that he understood it perfectly well, so he had a condition. He was about to say it, but then suddenly suggested that they talk about it outside. After that, they went outside and stopped at a truck. MC asked, did he mean to say that they would go to Gangnam on this truck, and once they got there, he would go back on an electric bike? The condition was that he had to give him his bike when he needed it? Yongsu replied with a smile that maybe the bike would help him a lot. But if he didn't mind, he would take him to Gangnam as fast as he could. 𝐥𝐸𝐲 thoughtfully touched the door of the truck's cargo area and said that he understood everything, after which he looked at him and thought, why would he take such a risk? Of course, he could outrun any monster, but regardless of his driving skills, the situation was extremely dangerous. And since he had already met his family and even brought them supplies, there was no point in taking such a risk. He sighed heavily and then shared his thoughts on the matter with him, saying that he came all this way for his wife and daughter. He just doesn't understand why he's trying to help him. He smiled and replied that he saved him, he owes his life to him. So why shouldn't he help him? Hearing his answer, the MC thought for a moment and remained silent, and the man said that if it weren't for his help, he wouldn't have been able to get here, he would have died in that tunnel. So he's just trying to help as much as he can. His words surprised 𝐥𝐸𝐲, and he asked if they weren't in the same situation? Even though good abilities had awakened in him, it doesn't mean that it's easy for him. Even though the world had become like this, they still held on to the idea of family. Like him when they were passing through that dangerous tunnel. He's in the same difficult situation. He laughed awkwardly and asked if it wouldn't be better if they helped each other survive. He thinks it would be a bit presumptuous of him to help him, but he shouldn't worry too much. If things get worse, he'll run away without hesitation. He's not stupid enough to give up on his life and family. His words made MC remember the moment when he was just driving into the tunnel. He noticed a car he was passing by, and something inside caught his attention. He stopped and looked inside, saw the key in the ignition, and then drove further into the tunnel. These memories confirmed Yongsu's words that he's not stupid enough to give up on his life, and 𝐥𝐸𝐲 sighed with a smile. The man in front of him smiled awkwardly and said that he would only follow him if he agreed, and MC then said that from what he saw, his ability is subspace, nothing can enter there without his permission. As long as the subspace is maintained, the goods in the logistics center can be copied. He replied that he knows. He explained it to him. MC said that if he wants to help him, he has conditions too. First, his destination is Gangnam, Yeoljiro, Dongbang, and then Ujeongbu. He asks him to stay with him until he meets his family at the last place. Second, he can't do it alone. If he strengthens the subspace, there will be people there. He can put him there with his wife and daughter. So if he goes, he should take his family. He opened a portal to the logistics center behind him and said that by catching mutants, he can raise the level of the subspace. If he helps him look for his family, he can protect them too. 𝐤𝐸 laughed and then put on his sunglasses and said with a confident smile on his face that he will bring his wife and daughter, so they can leave right away. After that, 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐸𝐴𝐻 started to improve the subspace, and the system asked if he wants to spend 100 magic stones to raise the level to 2. At the moment, he has 116 stones. He agreed to this, and the system reported that the subspace has reached the 2nd level. Now 6 magic stones are required for maintenance. As the subspace level increases, the number of people it can accommodate will increase to 20, and he can also store omens right in front of him. MC said that the maintenance cost of 6 stones is high. He will check it later. Now he has other things to do. He turned around and the system reported that outsiders are trying to enter the subspace. Does he allow 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐠, Liu Zhong, and Li Yongsu to enter? He allowed it, and the 3 people entered the logistics center, after which they looked around and were very surprised by the size of this room. 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐸𝐴𝐻 waved his hand to Pax and a robot drove up to them, after which MC pointed it out and said with a smile that if they need anything while they are here, they should just call Pax. They can check the robot for the items, and order delivery if necessary. There is also a fresh food center here, so they have access to almost all the ingredients. 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐠 asked if he allows them to take any things and food from here. Every product is priceless. Can they use it? He said it's okay, the supply is endless. She was surprised, and he said that since everything can be duplicated, they should feel free to take whatever they want. He turned to 𝐤𝐸𝐲𝐸 and told him to rest. They would be leaving in about half an hour. He will check how he managed to improve his ability in the meantime. He said that he is always ready, and 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐸𝐻 smiled and said that if they have any questions, they should feel free to ask. 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐠 thanked him and bowed slightly, and 𝐤𝐸𝐲 asked his daughter if she wants to play princess with him. They haven't played for so long. She was happy and agreed, and her mother said that she will make something to eat later. After that, MC walked away from them and decided to see what new abilities he now had. The system said that he could unlock the lab for 50 magic stones. There, he could combine, classify, and transform items registered in the subspace. After that, he wondered what kind of power he had. His ability was subspace. He could send anything there and access that object or subject at any time. No one would enter the subspace until he allowed it. Perhaps this was the limit of his original abilities. When the logistics center went into his subspace, and the Pax AI and the operating system merged, his abilities went beyond simply opening and closing the subspace, resulting in new functions. A typical example is delivery, which throws out goods at a speed of 100 km per hour. After the merger, the abilities of the subspace became simply fantastic. So he didn't think that any special abilities would appear even if he increased his level. However, a system window appeared in front of him with a message that as the subspace level increases, he can store items right in front of him. He was very surprised and thought that he can do more than that. He can actually create a research lab that can combine, classify, and transform goods. What else could this mean? That is, he can create new goods by combining old ones? For this, he needs 50 magic stones. In any case, he is sure that as he levels up, he will get even cooler abilities. He wants to get acquainted with all the new possibilities, but unfortunately he does not have enough magic stones. Now he can confirm the following. He can place an object in front of him in the subspace. The first time he put Pax in the subspace, he thought he was crazy and said the first thing that came to his mind. But in fact, Pax was completely preserved in the subspace. If this subspace can really contain anything, then he has something to try. He said the word Earth, and the system reported that the target was identified. He wanted to save it? He confirmed it with a confident face and began to wait, and after a few seconds, the system reported that it was impossible to save Earth in subspace. The target was out of range. He sighed in disappointment, and said that he thought it wouldn't work. It was only fair, otherwise he would be omnipotent. Suddenly, 𝐤𝐸𝐲𝐸 came up to him and, looking at the map, said that he looked at the route to Gangnam. He pointed his finger at it, and said that he thought it would be better to take this big road. 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐸𝐴𝐻 agreed with them and asked in surprise, didn't he say that he was going to play with his daughter? The man turned around with a smile and MC followed his gaze to see 𝐤𝐸𝐲𝐸 sleeping on the floor surrounded by toys. Her father said that she felt safe here, so after playing for a while, she immediately fell asleep. It's a little late, but he's very grateful to him. 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐻 smiled and said that they help each other, so it's fair. Yongsu agreed with him and added that it's the so-called balance. In general, he will help him as much as he can. MC was a little surprised, and when they were already in the truck, he got nervous and asked him to wait, saying that he had a bad feeling because he suddenly became so serious. He turned his gaze to the smiling Yongsu, and he said that the only thing he could help with was driving. But he could definitely drive faster than anyone else. 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐻 asked fearfully if he could not drive so fast. He replied that since he was helping, there was no way he could, so they would drive even faster. His words made him cry, and then the truck suddenly took off and drove along the city streets. They drove past dilapidated buildings and entered a wide street. Yongsu said that it was quieter here than on the main road. It seemed that there were more monsters where there were people. MC agreed with him and said that he didn't know that there was such a road on the way to Seoul. His friend said that this area seemed to be from the Bronze Age or something, which is why it wasn't developed much. The road was a bit rough, but there were no monsters or weird people. The MC wearily agreed with him and said that he wished this road would end soon. Suddenly, Yongsu's eyes widened and he saw something ahead. There was a fence and spikes in their path. They immediately realized that it was a military barricade, and Yongsu asked if he thought the military was still there. There was a military base nearby. 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐻 looked out the window and said that it was unlikely to be soldiers. He noticed a car moving towards them in the rearview mirror and said that the equipment was indeed military, but these guys didn't look like military personnel. He had the impression that they were hiding somewhere and watching them approach. It would be difficult for them to get out. Yongsu became worried and asked what they should do. He replied that he would open a small portal under the steering wheel, so let him go into it. Before leaving, he asked if he could handle it himself, and he replied that if they had the intent to kill, they would have started shooting right away. After he left, the MC moved to the driver's seat and saw that there were 3 of them. A man named 𝐸𝐸𝐲𝐻 approached him and said disappointedly that he so wanted to see the tires burst. 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐻 asked what was the matter, and he replied dissatisfiedly that it was a test. Let him get out of the cabin and open the trunk to check. He listened to them and opened the cargo compartment, and they, seeing a bunch of boxes with supplies inside, were very happy and 𝐸𝐸𝐻 asked, "Is this all his?" MC confirmed his words and the man said that he guessed wrong, now it's theirs. After his words, 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐻 immediately realized that their goal was food and supplies, and 𝐸𝐸𝐻 asked where he got all this. He hesitated before answering and nervously said that he got it from the logistics center. But if they decided to go to it, they wouldn't be able to because the roads leading there were destroyed and blocked. If they needed more supplies, he could bring them. 𝐸𝐸𝐻 looked at him suspiciously and then asked how much food was left. He replied that they were looking at almost 1% of the total supply right now. The man didn't believe him at first and asked if he was serious. The MC confirmed his words, and at that moment, another man looked at his watch and told 𝐸𝐸𝐻 that the time was up. After that, he said that he thought they had no other choice and called out to 𝐸𝐻𝐲𝐻, ordering him to get the food. 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐻 wondered what they were just talking about, and the man ordered Mingyu to take care of the truck and that he would take care of this guy. Right after that, he clenched his fist and punched MC in the chest, which made him feel a lot of pain and immediately fell to his knees, and one of the men put a bag over his head. He was taken to an unknown place and he heard 𝐸𝐸𝐻 knock on the door and tell the boss that it was him, and when he was allowed to enter, the man asked, "Is this the guy?" 𝐸𝐸𝐻 confirmed his words and said that he brought everything from the logistics center. There was no time left, so he brought him here. The man wanted to take a look at him and the bag was immediately removed from 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐻's head and a bright light hit his face. He found himself tied to a chair and looked around. In front of him at the table was the commandant, and on the wall hung a Korean flag. Apparently he was in the office. He turned his gaze to the side and, noticing a soldier lying in blood, he became nervous and thought, where did they take him? Is this a military base? The commandant said that he heard from the guys that he brought the supplies in his truck. And they said that he came from the logistics center and was the only one who could get in there. Was everything he said true? The MC twisted his words and said that he collected the supplies from the Gunpo Logistics Center. The commandant praised him and said that he too should have looked in a place like that first. 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐻 became worried and asked where he was and what was going on. The man leaned back in his chair and asked what he thought. It was obvious that this was a military unit. He wondered what the military unit was called and then said that I think it was called the Communications Command. The MC immediately realized that he was talking about the ministry's Communications Command, and the man said that he did not serve in it, so he did not know the exact name. He wanted to start a conversation about what was going on, but suddenly realized that it was almost 6 p.m. and told him to look. It was easier to show than to explain. 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐻 didn't understand what he was talking about at first, and then suddenly loud screams were heard from outside. The man wasn't surprised at all and lazily said that they had already arrived. MC recognized the screams and looked to the side and saw wyverns outside the window. But there were so many of them that they almost covered the entire sky, and some of them were different from their relatives. He became nervous and thought, are these wyverns too? But they are so huge. The commandant said that these creatures are very dangerous. He thought that he was quite strong, but he is not even close to them. He had a feeling that all his attacks were blocked by something. He pointed his finger at the soldier lying on the floor and said that he heard from him that the military had their own plan. They wanted to attack them with weapons, but everyone died. If even his ability doesn't work, then how can bullets work? The soldier said that they were recruiting people to fight the monsters, but when he came here, he saw that those brave soldiers were already dead. Funny, right? Anyway, he's in charge here now. Don't get me wrong, he hasn't killed him yet. He guesses that he knows a lot of useful things, but maybe he's not in the best shape right now because he hasn't been fed for a long time. He suggested that they get back to business and said that there are weapons in this place, but unfortunately, there is no food. So he will go with the guys to the logistics center and get them food. They will leave tomorrow morning, and if he succeeds, they will accept him as their own. It's beneficial for both of them, they can protect him from those monsters. 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐻 didn't let him finish and said that he was thinking about what to take, and this place seemed ideal to him. He turned to Pax and ordered that the ministry's communications command be sent to subspace. The man didn't understand what he was talking about and asked, was he completely crazy? At that moment his office suddenly disappeared and he, realizing that they had miraculously found themselves outside, was very surprised. The rest of the soldiers froze in amazement and began to look around, and the commandant, following their example, asked in bewilderment, how did this happen? Where did the whole building go? At that moment MC suddenly vomited and frowned, thinking that he felt bad just like when he hid Pax in subspace. Could this really be a side effect? Deciding that he needed to quickly cut the rope, he got down to business, and 𝐸𝐲𝐻, ignoring him, looked at the sky and nervously said that they were flying from there. Black silhouettes were reflected in his wide-open eyes. A huge flock of wyverns was heading straight for them. One of the wyverns screamed loudly, calling on its relatives to attack, and the bandits immediately began to run. At this time, 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐻 freed himself from the rope and the commandant, calling everyone idiots, ordered them to shoot. Let them get rid of the small monsters first, and then they will kill the big ones together. Gunfire won't help, he will use his power, so let them all come here. But seeing that they are not paying attention to him, he cursed and hissed through his teeth that they are traitors, after which a roar was heard nearby. A wyvern landed next to him. He looked up at the monster. Compared to the other wyverns, this creature was huge. The wyvern was in no hurry to attack and looked at him closely, but noticed a bright flash nearby and looked at the portal, which MC was now leaving with the wounded soldier. The system reported that an outsider was trying to enter the subspace. Does it allow Han Kyunggo to enter? He gave his permission and, entering the logistics center, thought that his head was spinning so much. He managed to get inside safely while the others were distracted, but next time he would have to think about the consequences when he puts something in subspace. If he puts something away in an emergency, he might die. He decided to turn around to check the situation, and saw that a huge wyvern was looking at them, not distracted by anything. This seemed strange to him and he thought, why is it staring at him like that? Suddenly, a furious scream was heard and the wyvern immediately looked at the man who attacked it. He hit the monster and told it to die. He also leveled up, so he is not as soft as before. He is not a coward who runs away. He continued to hit the wyvern and 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐻 looked at him one last time, after which the monster grabbed the man with its teeth and he died on the spot. MC continued to drag the wounded soldier towards himself and it became hard for him, and Yongsoo, noticing everything, immediately ran up and asked, is he okay? He knelt down and replied that everything is fine, and his comrade asked, who is with him? He replied that he seems to be a military officer. It seems that he was tortured by bandits, and his condition is not very good. He needs to put him on the bed so he can rest. Yongsoo volunteered to help him and they put the soldier on the bed, after which they sighed tiredly. Yongsoo said that he didn't seem to have any serious injuries or bleeding. He said that he was attacked by some bandits? He confirmed his words and said that he himself didn't see it, but that's what the ones who captured him said. However, He heard that he was in bad shape from the beginning because he was starving. Once he wakes up, they need to feed him something. And soon, a new building will appear in the subspace. 𝐤𝐸 said that he was just about to ask about it. He turned to the window and asked what kind of building was that. From the outside, it looks very big. It looks like some kind of military base. Jeongeum was very surprised and replied that this is it, but he didn't know it was that big. In fact, he couldn't see what the building was like from the outside because they put a bag over his head. 𝐤𝐸 was very surprised and his comrade said that he needed to check on something. Could he please keep an eye on that person for a bit? He'll be right back. 𝐤𝐸 agreed and wished him a good trip, after which he looked after him in surprise and thought that he had moved the military base, and now he was going there. Getting on his bike, MC left the logistics center and headed to the base with the thought that there should be a lot of useful things there. From weapons, ammunition, explosives, strategic materials, gas masks, to military equipment. In an apocalyptic world, there is no better place to survive. He rode past military vehicles and thought that this base would be difficult to use just like the logistics center. PAX is responsible for everything in the center, and it can deliver things to him. And who does this at the base? There is an arsenal, warehouses, and if he needs something, he will have to look for it himself. The problem is that he is not aware of the structure of the base, he does not know how big it is. It is even bigger than the logistics center. The problems will start when they find weapons and ammunition, and 𝐤𝐸, who has no combat skills, will be the one who will have to use all of it. He imagined how in the midst of a battle, 𝐤𝐸 would have to go to the warehouse every time to get ammunition and wondered how long it would take them to do that. He also needed to consider that, unlike the logistics center, the supplies were not unlimited. They would have to use weapons less often and it would require a lot of manual labor. PAX, who heard him reasoning about this, said that this was not the case. Jeongeum was surprised by the sudden appearance of the drone, and it said that this subspace was programmed by the logistics system of the AI company PAX. Therefore, this newly annexed Sector No. 2 was also considered a type of logistics warehouse and was handled in a similar manner. MC immediately stopped his bike and asked in surprise, what did this mean? The drone replied that it was currently being analyzed. Once the classification of the commodity codes for all the objects existing in Sector No. 2 was completed, they could be used as goods in Sector No. 1. He asked, so rifles and ammunition could be copied and sent just like the products in the logistics center? PAX confirmed his words, but he was still very surprised. The drone said that as mentioned earlier, the data is currently being analyzed. The current progress is 0.81%. He asked how long it will take to complete. The drone replied that it is difficult to give an exact forecast, it all depends on the specific item. Let him tell him what goods he needs, and they will be assigned a code. Does he have any goods he wants to purchase? Jeongeum's eyes lit up with excitement, and he said that he would like to purchase firearms, ammunition with grenades, as well as a vehicle and fuel. PAX said that to start with, these goods will be assigned a code. It will take about 10 minutes. He asked if he can prohibit someone else from ordering these goods. The drone confirmed his words and he thought that it was not that he distrusted 𝐤𝐸 and his family, but that military man made him suspicious. It would not be superfluous to be cautious. After finding out how things were going with the military base, he decided to open the portal and see what was outside. As soon as the portal opened, the wyverns that were eating the bandits immediately looked in his direction, and he thought that he hoped that the situation outside would somehow improve itself, but that was unlikely. There were too many monsters that they needed to get rid of, and he didn't think they could kill that big guy. After that, he moved to the logistics center with the guns and ammunition, and his friend, putting on gloves, said that so much time had passed since his service in the army, and here he was shooting again. MC said that he ordered boxes of ammunition, they have 10,000 rounds. If the gun breaks, then let him just throw it away and take a new one. It would be nice if the magazines were immediately installed in the guns, but unfortunately, this is not registered in the system. He can shoot, right? 𝐤𝐸 smirked in response and, taking the gun, confirmed his words and said that there are so many things here that he can test his reservist skills on. He took aim and said that it was probably faster to show than to just explain. After that, he opened fire and bright flashes appeared in the portal. The bullets began to pierce the wyverns' bodies and their painful roars could be heard. 𝐤𝐸 continued shooting the monsters, stopping to change magazines, and then fired again, raising a ruckus in the logistics center. The barrel of the gun became very hot from the continuous fire, and when there were no monsters left, 𝐤𝐸 finished and said that it was quite difficult to shoot quickly in a volley at once. He looked at the corpses and asked, did they manage? 𝐥𝐸𝐲 looked closely and became wary, and then replied that they did not. 𝐸𝐭 did not understand what was going on, and said that he did not see a single wyvern here that could stand up. MC said that the large specimens had disappeared somewhere. He saw a couple of impressive monsters. At that moment, a huge wyvern was hiding behind the portal and carefully studying it, and even touched it to check how it worked. The protagonist looked through the portal at the dead creatures and thought, no matter how he looked, he still couldn't find it. Did he hide or something? 𝐸𝐭 stood next to him, clutching a machine gun in his hands. 𝐥𝐸𝐲 frowned and said they'll do this. Maybe this guy is waiting for them outside, so first they'll put out a bait, like a remote-controlled toy. If there's no reaction, then they can just move on. And if it does show itself, then they can set up an ambush. 𝐸𝐭 replied, okay, it doesn't hurt to be careful. But can a remote-controlled toy cope with the role of bait? He has a plan. After a while, the guys put a dummy on the remote-controlled car and sent it forward, through the portal. Suddenly, the wyvern attacked it, and they jerked in surprise. 𝐸𝐭 screamed, and he really was hiding. This guy is also interested in military reserves. He widened his eyes in fear and froze when the wyvern stopped and looked at him. It growled, and the protagonist took aim and ordered to shoot. The guys fired and an explosion occurred next to the creature, and then another. After a while, the smoke cleared and glowing eyes appeared from it. The wyvern opened its mouth and growled loudly. The guys looked at it in fear, and the creature tried to stick its muzzle through the portal. 𝐸𝐭 sat on one knee and asked in confusion, how was it still standing? 𝐥𝐸𝐲 widened his eyes and thought, did it withstand the bullets? Did the creature really have such thick skin? He said to wait and remembered the commandant's words. He had a feeling that all his attacks were blocked by something. He thought about it, the commandant said so, now he understood what he meant. The wyvern continued to stare persistently through the portal, and the protagonist thought, sure, there was no damage not because it had thick skin, but because something was blocking the attacks. The creature roared loudly, opening its toothy mouth. Suddenly, a grenade with a torn-off pin rolled to the wyvern's feet, and the creature looked at it, puzzled. 𝐥𝐸𝐲 suggested to see who would win. Is it stronger in defense, or their attacks are more powerful? He smirked and said, by the way, they have endless supplies here. An explosion occurred near the creature, and then 𝐸𝐭 threw another grenade and ordered it to eat this one too. Several dozen grenades rained down one after another, and the wyvern roared loudly. Many explosions occurred outside the portal, and after a while, only smoke remained there. The protagonist and 𝐸𝐭 stood sweaty after such exhausting work. 𝐸𝐭 leaned on his knees and said, he didn't know throwing grenades was so difficult. 𝐥𝐸𝐲 replied, yes, his shoulder is about to fall off. He frowned and said, monster? The creature leaned over again and flashed its glowing eyes. It extended its sharp claw and hit the portal. The protagonist grabbed his right hand and thought, they sent a whole arsenal of explosives at the creature, and it just slightly scratched its skin. What kind of evil spirit is this? The creature turned around and flapped its huge wings and left. 𝐸𝐭 asked, puzzled, did it go away? 𝐥𝐸𝐲 answered, yeah, it looks like it did. But it's unlikely to be because of their attacks. In any case, the monster retreated, so it's time for them to get out of there too. Can he drive at night? 𝐸𝐭 answered, of course. After a while, the guys left in a military car and 𝐸𝐭 spoke. He was still shocked by this huge wyvern. The protagonist looked at him and spoke, even if he doesn't speak. He thought, they had to detonate dozens of grenades to somehow injure it. Although they can't call it wounds. What if they come across even stronger creatures? What kind of weapon would they use against such monsters? Of course, grenades contain gunpowder. But since they are designed for effective destruction, they are weapons that are more dangerous in terms of fragmentation than in terms of explosive force. But other explosives, the result of this action can be unpredictable. If you use a rocket, the explosion will be huge. But innocent people might get hurt. What should he do then? He thought, besides, even if the firepower is great, there is no guarantee that one missile will kill the monster. He thinks he will have to make at least a few shots. And then he will become the real monster. A compromise is needed. An analog of a missile, but which will not cause much damage to the area. To strike with something extremely heavy, or something extremely fast? 𝐥𝐸𝐲 put his hand to his face and thought, rifles and grenades are the only option now. Alas, totally alas. And of course, one more thing. He needs to constantly strengthen his abilities. By the way, they just recently finished off several wyverns. So there should be enough stones for improvement. The system window in front of him reported that there are 314 magic stones in stock. The protagonist looked at this thoughtfully and shouted, "What?" He wondered when they collected so many. 𝐤𝐸 turned around and looked at him questioningly. 𝐥𝐸 thought about it. He felt like there were a lot of them, but could wyverns really drop such a great resource? He was so lucky. The system window reported that he had used 25 magic stones. The delivery speed would be increased from 100 km per hour to 150 km per hour. He had used 25 magic stones to reduce the delivery time from 5 seconds to 1 second. He had used 50 magic stones to increase the number of items that could be sent at once from 2 to 4. He had used 25 magic stones to increase the delivery range from 25 meters to 50 meters. 𝐥𝐸 thought about it. 4 items were sent at intervals of 1 second. The number of magic stones had increased. The abilities were becoming more and more powerful. The system window showed that there were 189 magic stones in stock. The protagonist thought there was still something that needed to be improved. He poked at the screen and the system window reported that he had used 50 magic stones to open a space laboratory. He was still wondering what it was. 𝐥𝐸 looked at the system window carefully and thought, he wants to try it. Maybe he should stop the car first. He looked to the side and said, 𝐤𝐸, he needs to check something, so he needs to stop for a while. 𝐤𝐸 looked ahead carefully and said, if they drive a little further, they will get to Gangnam. In any case, there are not many monsters nearby, he can drive further. Let him go alone. The protagonist looked at him fearfully and asked, is he sure? It's too dangerous. 𝐤𝐸 looked at him and answered, but he rarely gets a chance to drive anyway. If he's really worried, how about just leaving the portal open and continuing driving? 𝐥𝐸 said puzzledly, it is. He looked out the window, and a portal appeared next to him. He said it worked. He walked out of the portal, and 𝐤𝐸 said, if something happens, he will just enter the portal. No need to worry, let him go. The protagonist looked out and said, he understands anyway, let him be careful. He entered the portal and looked around and thought, at first glance, it doesn't look that special. He walked forward and thought, it's just different from other spaces. 𝐥𝐸 said, okay. What kind of ability is this? A system window appeared in front of him. It said, combination, he can combine 2 or more objects without paying attention to physical conditions. Separation, he can separate an object into its components, it's closed. 𝐥𝐸 said, yes. Combination, does it mean that if you combine a machine gun and a magazine, they can be registered as a single product? Pax flew by and said yes. The protagonist looked up and asked, and separation, does it mean that he can register a grenade by removing the safety ring from it? Pax said yes. 𝐥𝐸 asked, won't it explode then? Pax said products registered in the subspace exist as data while in the warehouse. Unless he uses the grenade to send or place an order, it will not undergo any physical processes. The protagonist put his hand to his chin and said, well, that's good to know. Let it register the grenade by removing the trigger guard and pin. Pax said, he used 15 magic stones to register the new item. 𝐥𝐸 thought about it. He can't create something that can defeat a giant wyvern. But there are no options for now. He opened the system window and asked, by the way, should he register the rifle with a magazine inserted? It would be nice to use 2 magazines, without the hassle. Suddenly, his eyes widened and said, if so, he can make a powerful weapon. More powerful than a missile, which will not cause much damage to everything around. At this moment, 𝐤𝐸 drove up to a huge mountain of cars and asked, what is this? He held the steering wheel in his hands and asked with his mouth open, a wall of cars, what kind of horror is this? At that moment, the protagonist came out of the portal and asked, is everything okay? 𝐤𝐸 answered, yes, he understood, there were no monsters, not a single one. But there was something that puzzled him greatly. 𝐥𝐸 looked out and froze in surprise. 𝐤𝐸 said, someone blocked the road with cars. It would be difficult to pass. He thought they would have to turn around. The protagonist answered, no, that was not necessary. It so happened that he had just made a new weapon. 𝐤𝐸 looked at him, puzzled, and asked, a new weapon? At that moment, huge assembled discs flew out of the portal and headed towards the mountain of cars. It began to fly apart in different directions, freeing the road. 𝐤𝐸's eyes widened and he froze, looking ahead. He said, 𝐥𝐸, what did he even create? At that moment, the men came out of the building and looked at it. The man was clutching a mop in his hand and asking, what happened, did the wall fall? The second man answered with displeasure, it was strong, it couldn't just collapse. He frowned and looked thoughtfully at the car that pulled out. The men looked at it in fear and asked, "What? The military?" The protagonist opened the window and asked, "Is Nurse Kim Ji-in here?" He remembered the girl screaming, "This is a drop kick, bro." He flew into him with both feet, and Ji-in turned around and asked, "Guys, let's be quieter. She is the first sister in the Kim family, Kim Ji-in. She said that because of them she can't study for the exam." The girl looked at her puzzled and asked, "Sister, is she sick? Why did she suddenly start studying so hard?" Ji-in asked, "What surprises her?" The protagonist said, "Yes, she clearly doesn't feel well. Maybe they should tell Mom?" The sister answered, "She agrees." Ji-in turned around and screamed in irritation, "She just decided to study. What's wrong with that?" Ji-in is 8 years older than Jeongeum. He was 7 when she decided to get her act together and devote her time to studying. She was one of those sisters who couldn't sit through half a lesson without going crazy from boredom. So this change worried the whole family. Mom came into the room and asked Ji-in, "What happened?" Ji-in frowned and replied, "Everything is fine." But the sister started studying for a rather ordinary reason. She said that she had a dream. The guys widened their eyes and, pointing their fingers at her, asked, "A dream?" Ji-in showed a red book called The History of an Apple Tree and said that even if the world ends tomorrow, she wants to take care of the sick until the very end. Everyone around looked at her with puzzled eyes. The girl frowned and said that in her opinion, she is not sick. The sister has simply gone crazy. Maybe they will call the orderlies? However, her aspiration turned out to be more than just a childish dream of a middle school student. Ji-in's grades were getting better in high school as well. A few years later, her father announced that Ji-in had entered medical school. The brother and sister shouted, "Oh, come on!" And the result of her hard work was that she successfully passed the medical exam. At present, Ji-in covered her mouth with her hand and cried. She asked how, where from, why is he not injured? The protagonist sobbed and said, "Thank heavens." Yongsoo looked at it and smiled and said, "Amazing." Jeongeum hugged his sister and said how glad he was that she was alive. By the way, let her meet him. That person helped him a lot. He only got there thanks to him. Yongsoo nodded his head and said, "Hello, his name is Lee Yongsoo." Ji-in nodded back and said, "Kim Ji-in, Jeongeum's older sister. Thank you for helping her brother." She reached into her pocket and said to wait a minute, let them at least give them a treat. She has a chocolate bar there. The main character waved his hand and told her to keep it. They have already eaten a lot of chocolate bars. There is something more important. He put his hand to his lips and said, "Patient." Ji-in's eyes widened and asked, "Where?" She frowned and ordered to take her there immediately. Jeongeum replied, "That person is not here. He is in a space that can only be entered with his power." Ji-in put her hand to her lips and asked, "Powers?" "Wow, he's awakened." The protagonist answered seriously, "Yes, but for them to enter the space, he must open the entrance. It will be strange if outsiders see." Ji-in turned around and answered, "It is impossible to move around here secretly now." Jeongeum frowned and turned around and asked, "No secluded room at all?" After a while, the guys entered the room where people were sleeping on benches, and a sign was visible on the wall, "A restroom." Opening the door, the guys entered and closed the door behind them. After a while, Ji-in's eyes widened in shock and said, "This can't be." She looked at the protagonist's building and asked, "What's going on? Is this building also part of his power?" Jeongeum went inside and turned around and asked, "He will tell you everything, but later, okay? We have to go now." After a while, they put the military man on the bed and Ji-in began to examine him. The protagonist put his hand on his neck and asked, "What does she say?" Ji-in frowned and asked, "How long has this man been like this?" Jeongeum said, "He doesn't know. He found him like this on the way to her." Ji-in said, "It looks like he was tortured. Or maybe something worse, beast. This guy, he might not survive." The protagonist's eyes widened in fear and asked, "Is it that bad?" Ji-in extended her hand and said, "It could be. But she activated her energy and said, "Can he see? She has powers too. She is a real healer now. The power is still low, so the treatment will take a long time, and it will be difficult to completely heal the wound. But he will not die." Ji-in put her hand on his body and began treating. After a while, she said, "That's all for now. This is just first aid, but he is severely exhausted. Malnutrition is now more dangerous than the wound. With proper nutrition, he will recover much faster." The protagonist asked Ji-in, "Even if the world ends, she will still take care of the sick, right?" Ji-in turned around and asked, What made him suddenly remember? 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐻 smiled and said, he remembers every word, sis. Even if the world ends tomorrow, she wants to take care of the sick until the very end. Yongsu looked at him puzzled, and Julian shouted, hey! She said she should have trained him when he was little, like what happened with Seoul. Okay, let's move on. He promised to tell about his powers and where he was. The protagonist answered thoughtfully, the story is a bit long, but… Yongsu interrupted him and said, his wife baked some bread, we can talk over food. After a while, 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐻 began to tell about everything he went through recently. Julian said, that's it? The protagonist asked the question, is she listening? She smiled and chewed her food and answered, yes, of course. 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐻 frowned and asked where he was. Julian answered with her mouth full, the warehouse, he was stuck and Pax saved him? The protagonist said, she was missing a lot, but there was nothing wrong with that. Julian smiled and said, it was delicious. She believes that a good person is a good cook. 𝐥𝐸 replied, she was glad they liked it. It was a pity there was no rice. If they weren't full, there was still bread in the fridge, they could take some, don't be shy. She smiled and said, oh 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐻, she prepared the restroom on the first floor. There are beds and other things there now. Since they don't have anyone here, maybe they can settle there? The protagonist asked in surprise, wow, she's already arranged everything here? Thank you. 𝐥𝐸 started to leave and replied, she just wanted to help. There's bread in the oven, so she'll go. Julian looked after her and said, thank you again. She looked at 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐻 and asked how they got here. He replied, she wasn't listening to him at all. He doesn't want to tell everything again. To get to the point, he's going to introduce his family to this space. She's here now, so he's going to go to 𝐤𝐥iro now. The other Kim sister is in 𝐤𝐥iro. Julian said, 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐻, let him forgive her, but she's staying there. The protagonist asked, why? Does she have a lot of patients? Julian replied, it's true, there are more than 300 people in the hospital, and there are patients who need constant observation or medication. But that's not the problem. Other nurses can take care of the sick. After a while, Sunhak asked, are there two of them? The guy replied, yes. The security guys said that there was a loud noise, a wall of cars collapsed. And then a military vehicle drove in. Sunhak asked, special forces? The guy replied, they don't know, but one of them seems to be Nurse 𝐥𝐸𝐻's younger brother. Sunhak turned around and asked, really? Then they won't be too hostile to them. He hoped. The sign said, Department Head, Jin Sunhak. He said, no need to worry. He thinks they came to eat and spend the night, and they have everything here. They can control the food, or they can use Kim Julian. And no matter how strong they are awakened, are they stronger than him? The pumped-up guy stood behind him and answered, it's unlikely. Sunhak replied, okay. First of all, let him greet them warmly, pretend to be nice, does he understand? Hyungu replied, yes. Sunhak asked, did he repair the broken wall? Hyungu replied, yes, and did it higher. At this time, the protagonist folded his arms and asked, poisoning? Julian said, or withdrawal symptoms. There is simply no other explanation for how people change overnight. 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐻 said, wait a minute, Jin Sunhak, the head of the infectious diseases department, is he using his position to poison people and control them? Julian answered, right on target. You could say that all the awakened died except for her. They are basically drug addicts, guarding their food and magic stones. The protagonist said to Chu and then talk. Julian answered, she doesn't know why Nana and the other nurses didn't get addicted, but she stole magic stones little by little to increase her abilities. If she increases her level a little more, she might be able to cure people of their addictions. She scooped up food with a spoon and said, so he will go look for their family. She will try to survive here somehow. The protagonist answered, nope. Julian frowned and said displeasedly, 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐻. Didn't he hear? It's dangerous. The protagonist answered, did she hear him? Julian turned around and looked at him questioningly. Julian folded his arms across his chest and replied, the weapon that the manager is holding is food. Then it's simple. He smiled and said, he will deal with this part as quickly as possible, so in the meantime, let her take a closer look. What are his abilities? There is no need to waste time, we need to go right now. Julian looked at him puzzledly and asked, is it another teenage rebellion? Suddenly, her eyes widened in surprise, and the protagonist moved the boxes of food to himself. After a while, Sunhak looked away and said, he was wondering what the urgent report would be about, but it turned out to be about the fact that Nurse Kim Julian's younger brother brought food. The guy folded his hands behind his back and said, yes, but that's quite a lot. Sun Hak said he didn't think there was any need to worry. How much food did he think two people could bring, considering they were in a simple military vehicle? People would soon take everything from them. And when the supplies ran out, all they could do was ask them to share. They should have hidden the food instead of sharing it with everyone. The guy said, speaking of which. Sun Hak ignored him and said smugly, this made their job easier than they thought. They didn't even have to do anything. The guy interrupted him and said they had more of everything than they had in stock. Sun Hak's eyes widened and he asked, what? How could that be? The guy replied, he didn't understand either. Sun Hak looked away and thought currently, the hospital food was delivered from outside by scouts. It was enough to fill an entire truck. They came in a military vehicle. How could they have more food than them? The ability, is it the ability to reproduce something? Or maybe that guy can shrink things and then return them to normal size. Whatever it is, he's definitely a person with an ability. They need to recruit him to their side. Sun Hak took out a bottle of pills and told him to give this medicine to Sun Hyun-gu and tell him to make Kim Ji-yeon's younger brother drink it. And if that doesn't work, just kill him. The guy answered yes. Sun Hak asked tensely, and there was another person with him, right? After a while, when the clouds thickened over the moon, the protagonist walked down the hallway and looked at the sleeping old man. He thought, it's unlikely that this is the one he needs. Did he happen to pass by him on the way here? He walked out and thought she said that he would be able to recognize him at first glance, but something doesn't add up. It would be easier to find him quickly. A while ago, Ji-yeon asked, so his plan is to neutralize the weapon that is in Jin Sun Hak's hands? Jeongeum answered yes, they can just pour out his food to be able to subdue the drug addict with abilities. Jin Sun Hak himself is not a threat. Ji-yeon asked if he knew what abilities the poison people had. The protagonist asked, what kind? Ji-yeon replied, well, some can open jars and have abilities that do his laundry for him. Jeongeum looked at her puzzled and asked, is she kidding? Ji-yeon frowned and replied, no. There aren't many people in the world whose abilities alone are a threat. The protagonist asked, what? Then it should be simpler. Ji-yeon frowned and said, except for one person. Jeongeum asked, one person? Ji-yeon replied, whose name is Song Hyun-gu. After the world fell into chaos, that person came all the way from Yeoljiro because he was worried about his mother who was hospitalized. Currently, the protagonist looked away and said, wow. He remembered Ji-yeon's words that she didn't know much about him except that he was strong. But he was so big that it was obvious. Didn't he see that wall of cars outside? This guy built this with his bare hands. Currently, Hyun-gu walked down the hallway and asked if he was Nurse Kim Ji-yeon's younger brother. They needed to talk. The protagonist smiled and said, that's good. He just had business with him. Hyun-gu looked at him questioningly and said, he didn't know what business he had with him, it didn't matter anymore. He pointed his finger at Jeongeum and said they only had two options. The protagonist asked again, options? Hyun-gu took out a bottle of pills and said, one of them is to drink this medicine right here and now. Or refuse and die. And let him not even think about running away. The protagonist looked around and said, he wondered why he brought him to such a dark place. He didn't plan on fighting or running away. With a physique like his, he would have caught him right away. Jeongeum looked at Hyun-gu and said, so he will choose the third option. Hyun-gu asked, what? The protagonist said the third option is to trap him. Hyun-gu got angry and rushed forward, stretching out his hand. Suddenly, he hit the portal and looked ahead in confusion, where a drone with a bowling ball was flying at him. The ball flew into his body and he fell down. The system window reported, professional rotating bowling ball, 239,801. Hyun-gu screamed in pain and the protagonist asked, is the speed of under 100 kilometers per hour too fast? He said to forgive, but he will have to beat him again. The next bowling ball crashed into Hyun-gu's body and he raised his head and asked what kind of ability is this? Suddenly, a stack of heavy discs fell in front of him and Jeongeum said it might be difficult for him to move, so he should not try. Hyun-gu frowned and looked at this. The protagonist spoke, he had already slowed down the thing, but even if he hit it like that, it would break all his bones because of its weight. Several hundred more discs fell in front of him, arranged in a pillar. Hyun-gu rushed forward and tried to lift the pillar, straining himself greatly. Jeongeum spoke, really? Hyun-gu screamed in tension, and suddenly the discs began to rise into the air. He looked at it with a puzzled look, and the protagonist said, thank you for listening to him and not moving. He was able to arrange them as close to each other as possible. It might be a little unpleasant, but he will release him once everything is clear. Let him wait a little longer. 𝐥𝐸𝐽 built a huge tower of discs and trapped Hyun-gu in it. The protagonist turned around and started to leave. He said he was worried that he might get seriously hurt. But he seemed strong. He went inside, and 𝐥𝐸𝐽 screamed, 𝐥𝐸𝐽. What was that loud sound? Did he meet Song Hyun-gu? The protagonist replied yes, he just came back from meeting him. 𝐥𝐸𝐽's eyes widened and asked, just now? The protagonist pointed to the side and replied, yeah, he's there. 𝐥𝐸𝐽 ran to the window and looked outside. She frowned and looked at the pile of CDs in confusion. She turned around and screamed loudly, what? How did this happen? 𝐥𝐸𝐽 replied, Mr. Song Hyun-gu is locked in there because… Long story. How is the food? 𝐥𝐸𝐽 replied she handed it out. The protagonist said, okay, then they'll have to wait for Young-soo. He looked to the side and said with a slight smile, here he is. 𝐥𝐸𝐽 turned around and said, well done. She looked at him in confusion and asked, Young-soo? He walked down the hallway holding his head. Young-soo narrowed his eyes and said, 𝐥𝐸𝐽, my head hurts a lot. Could this be a symptom of poisoning? 𝐥𝐸𝐽 answered, yes, that's it. What happened? The protagonist walked up to him and looked at him. Young-soo answered, he has no idea. He just shared some food and listened to a few words of gratitude. 𝐥𝐸𝐽 looked closely at his hand and thought, is there a cut on his finger? There wasn't one before? She said, there's a shallow wound on that finger. It looks like someone stabbed Young-soo and poisoned him. She thinks that person accidentally ran into him or something. Young-soo asked, who could have done it? The protagonist opened a portal and said, first they will enter the subspace so that he can rest. He hates to say it, but it looks like he will have to stay locked up for a while. Young-soo answered, yes, he agrees. 𝐥𝐸𝐽 thought, that's not good. He doesn't know how the poison works, but if Young-soo completely submits to this stuff, things will get complicated. He needs to meet Jin Si-hak urgently and figure out how to cure Young-soo. The protagonist said that he will send him to the rest room. Just in case, he will block the windows and doors. The system window reported that any unidentified energy that tries to penetrate from the outside is blocked. The subspace is an independent area of the user, and therefore energy communication with the outside world is impossible. 𝐥𝐸𝐽 and 𝐥𝐸𝐽 led Young-soo by the hands into the subspace. They entered and Young-soo asked, what is this, energy from the outside? 𝐥𝐸𝐽? The protagonist looked closely at the system window and asked, does he no longer have a headache? What? After a while, a noise came from the street and Hyun-gu asked, who is coming? The ground was covered in energy and the system window reported, Sun Hyun-gu is entering. He looked at it puzzledly and said, what is this? The system window said, does he want to take Sun Hyun-gu out of his subspace? Sun Hyun-gu comes out. He returned to the real world and fell on his side. Hyun-gu asked in surprise, what is this? How is this possible? In front of him stood 𝐥𝐸𝐽, 𝐥𝐸𝐽 and Young-soo, who were smiling. The protagonist thought, the subspace is invulnerable to attacks from the outside. But it blocks not only physical attacks, but also mental attacks. Hyun-gu walked up to the old woman who was lying on the bed and hugged her, and she said, son, finally. He asked her to forgive him, Mom. The woman said, it's not his fault. Hyun-gu told his mom to go to bed, he had something to do, so he would come back as soon as he finished. The old woman said, okay, she doesn't know what he will do, but please let him not get hurt. The protagonist looked at him and asked, is he sure he can handle it on his own? Hyun-gu replied, everything will be fine. As he probably realized, he is not someone who is easily hurt. And in fact, the memories of that time are too vivid. He frowned and said, he is ashamed and feels very guilty. But he thinks he should thank him and apologize after he sorts things out. Hyun-gu walked forward and said he owes him. Now it's time for him to sort out a few things. 𝐥𝐸𝐽 looked at him and remained silent. 𝐥𝐸𝐽 asked if everything would be okay. The protagonist replied yes. It was time for them to get to work. By the way, Song Hyun-gu was quite a tough nut to crack. Can they leave tomorrow morning? At that moment, Song-hak was sitting in the office, looking at the system window, which said that the connection had been cut off. He turned around and asked what had happened. Unbelievably, he had actually come. Hyun-gu was standing in front of him, tensing up in irritation. Song-hak closed his eyes and said yes, he didn't know how he had cut the connection with his powers, but let him tell him one thing. He smirked and asked for mercy. Hyun-gu got angry and smashed him against the wall with all his might. After Song Hyun-gu left to sort things out, they talked about how to rid the people in the hospital of addiction. The protagonist put his hands on his hips and suggested making them enter the subspace. They can't tell for sure who is addicted and who is not. Jian asked, is the idea good, but how will they do it? Jeongeum looked at her and said, he doesn't think it's difficult. It's late and there are people who have difficulty moving. It's enough for their finger to enter the subspace. Jian nodded her head and said, after all this, they will all become patients. Okay. Yongsoo said, there is no other way. But just when they were about to do this all night, suddenly an old man's voice was heard. What? What did he do anyway? Voices were heard everywhere. Honey. Is he back? Dad. He seemed out of his mind. The protagonist looked at the scene in surprise and asked, why did people suddenly become? At that moment, Hyun-gu's voice was heard. How long did they wait? He walked forward and his body was covered in blood. He walked over, smiled and said, gentlemen, he figured it out. Hyun-gu bowed and said, thank him very much for saving his mother, him, and everyone in the hospital. Jeongeum sighed in surprise and looked at him. Before they moved, Song Hyun-gu took care of Jin-si and Hak, and thanks to that, they didn't have to walk around the hospital. The protagonist said, he should be the one thanking him. He looked around and thought, without even asking, he understands how he dealt with everything. He spread his arms out and asked, by the way, is he feeling better? Let him forgive me for throwing the bowling ball too hard. Hyun-gu laughed and said, it's okay. His bones are intact, and it's just a slight bruise. Of course, he was very surprised. He had seen many monsters and strange phenomena, but seeing many pillars of discs falling from the sky was really amazing. Monsters don't even compare to this. Jeongeum laughed and said sometimes he was surprised by his own abilities. Hyun-gu asked, so, is he going to stay in the hospital? The protagonist's eyes widened and he looked at him with a puzzled expression. Hyun-gu said he knows it's a bit selfish to say that after they helped him. But honestly, he wishes they could stay at the hospital. Jeongeum nodded his head and said, he understands perfectly. But he hasn't met the rest of his family yet. He thinks they'll have to leave soon. Hyun-gu nodded his head and said, I see, he knows it's an unpleasant question, but it was necessary to ask. He hopes he can meet the others in peace. The protagonist nodded and thanked him. He said, by the way, they're going to Yujiro. He heard he came from there. How are things there? Hyun-gu asked. Yujiro? They probably can't go there. In the morning, Hyun-gu said, he's grateful for the food he gave the hospital and his supplies too. He doesn't know how to express his gratitude. He'll definitely repay their kindness. Jeongeum shook his hand and said that he hoped to see him and everyone in the hospital again. Hyun-gu said that the feeling was mutual. Let him take care of himself. The boys got into the car and headed forward. Yongsoo asked, by the way, what was this wall that Song Hyun-gu was talking about? It must be someone's ability, right? The protagonist answered, without a doubt. That's why he hoped that they could communicate with this person. Otherwise, they simply wouldn't be able to overcome this obstacle. He remembered Hyun-gu's words. It was hard to believe, but when he left Yujiro, a huge wall had grown between Yujiro and Namsan. Jeongeum asked again, a wall? Hyun-gu said yes, it sounds absurd when he describes it, but a stone wall really did grow from the ground. He ran away back then, so he doesn't know how big it is, but by now it should be bigger than a house. The protagonist thought about it. Moving on the ground seemed completely impossible. Destroying this too would be difficult, right? Hyun-gu remembered and said, and there was one more thing that surprised him when he came here. The types of monsters here and in Yujiro are slightly different. Yujiro had the most skeletons. Jeongeum asked again, skeletons? Hyun-gu answered, now that he thought about it, it would be more appropriate to call them undead. Not only do they resurrect, but their corpses also roam around. The protagonist thought, monsters that don't die, and a huge wall. Yujiro seemed to have become a restless area in many ways. Why is that? He was currently looking out the window and thinking, he wasn't worried about the second sister in Yujiro. On the contrary, he felt that she would be able to defeat the monster even without any abilities. At this moment, the system window reported an incoming call from Kim Juyeon from the subspace. He answered and asked, what? Juyeon raised her eyebrows and asked, is this how he treats his older sister? The soldier he saved woke up. The protagonist turned around and looked at the portal in surprise. After a while, Kyung-do said he heard he saved him. Thank him very much. He bowed and said, his name is Han Kyung-do, he is a lieutenant colonel, heading the 50th Information Corps of the Ministry of Defense. 𝐥𝐸𝐽 extended his hand and said, Kim 𝐥𝐸𝐽. He is glad that he woke up. Is he better? Kyung-go answered yes, he survived thanks to his treatment. He looked around thoughtfully and asked, by the way, do they know where they are? He can see the ROK Armed Forces Command headquarters from the outside. But there are no buildings around the ROK Armed Forces Command. The protagonist smiled and said yes. This is the staff restroom of the PAX FC Logistics Center. This is the subspace he created with his power. The outside is now Gangnam. They are heading to Hanam Bridge. Kyung-go asked, puzzled, what? Logistics Center, subspace. Outside is Gangnam, but Hanam Bridge? Juyeon pointed her thumb at the protagonist and said, simply put, this space was created thanks to this kid's ability. In fact, they are currently in Gangnam. Kyung-go said, Gangnam, I see? 𝐥𝐸𝐽 replied yes. Kyung-go frowned and asked if it's not too much trouble, but could he drop him off here? The protagonist asked, what? He thinks he misunderstood something. They have no intention of harming him. Yongsoo spoke up, he also received his help just like him. He is a kind person. Kyung-go shook his head and said, he knows he is not a threat since he saved and treated him. It's not that he doesn't trust him or anything. He can't tell them the exact reason, but he needs to contact the Joint Chiefs of Staff as soon as possible. 𝐥𝐸𝐽 said, there is a serious problem. He closed his eyes and said, if that is the case, fine, Pax. Have it bring banana milk and a sandwich. Pax said, delicious morning bread baked with butter costs 2,900 won. Bulgur banana milk costs 1,800 won. Kyung-go looked closely at the food in the protagonist's hand, who said, he can drop him off. He held out the food and said, however, he will not let him leave hungry. If he eats all of this and tells him what happened, he can leave. Kyung-go cried and took the food and said, but, it is hard to talk about. 𝐥𝐸𝐽 said, he is not a fan of bread. Then how about this? There were various delicious things on the table. After a while, Kyung-go ate and said, one day, creatures from another dimension began to appear all over the world at the same time. By creatures, he does not only mean monsters. Insects, animals, plants, and even terrain began to appear. Mountains, for example. The monsters from another world attacked everything that came their way. Even those who came with them from another world. He introduced a huge orc and said, while the government was responding to the monsters, they also began to search for and recruit awakened ones. From the awakened ones they recruited, they formed new units. Kyung-go ate and spoke, and these units were very effective in humiliating the monsters. When his unit was in the area around Gwacheon and Anyang, it seemed that soon this area would become stable. But the problems began when this monster appeared. He remembered how he looked at the huge wyvern in surprise. Kyung-go said, guns, grenades, shells, nothing could help deal with this dragon. They repeatedly contacted Defense Communications Command and nearby military units for support, but Gwacheon and Anyang were already on the verge of collapse, just like them, due to the powerful monster. Defense Communications Command did not send any response. It was strange. They managed to contact Gwacheon and Anyang, who were participating in the battles with the monsters, but Defense Communications Command did not even report that they had found the monster. In the end, they were left with no choice. Kyung-go recalled how he shouted, if this continues, they will all die here because of this dragon. No matter how long it takes, they are moving forward. To Defense Communications Command. He sat on the table and spoke, many of their comrades died or were injured in the relentless pursuit of the monster. The military shouted, awakened are needed to fight the monsters. They had to recruit awakened and resist while moving forward. After several days of moving, they finally arrived. Currently, Kyung-go was sitting at the table and continued to talk. As expected, the command was already empty. And soon they found out why. The documents he found there in the archives in the command building, a plan for a coup d'etat was written on them. The guys stared at him in surprise, and Kyung-go said, after that, he tried to contact the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but fell into a trap. The dragon was chasing him, and to make matters worse, the awakened ones he summoned killed the soldiers and took control of the command. 𝐥𝐸𝐽 wondered, so that's what happened. Kyung-go continued to chew and said the First Corps is probably currently preventing the government from gathering troops. The head of the command seems to be on their side. This is definitely being done secretly. He should report this as soon as possible. The protagonist said, a coup d'etat he understands. However, they need to go to Yujiro. He will drop him off once they cross the bridge over the Han River. He suggested that they travel together as far as possible. Kyung-go said they can drop him off right now, thanks for helping. The protagonist stood up and asked to please rest. Yongsu walked towards the portal and said he will go as fast as possible. 𝐥𝐸𝐲, are we leaving? The protagonist replied, not at top speed, but faster than now. Yongsu asked, what is he talking about, 𝐥𝐸𝐲? Time is running out, so they should go as fast as possible. Kyungo looked at them and thought, if he saved him, then he must have encountered a dragon. How did he manage to get rid of that evil spirit? He can't tell what kind of abilities it has just by looking at it. Suddenly, he widened his eyes and saw a huge orc standing in front of the portal. He screamed, ahead! There's a monster ahead! The protagonist pointed his new weapon towards it, which surprised Kyungo. A pillar of weight discs crushed the monster, and drops of blood splattered everywhere. Kyungo widened his eyes and froze, thinking, discs? Shot the orcs with stacked discs? 𝐥𝐸𝐲 said, Pax, let him give them War Machine number 1. Pax said, yes, okay. The War Machine drove out of the portal onto the street, and Kyungo thought, War Machine? The protagonist turned around and said to eat, and then rest. He got into the car and said they will be there soon. He will leave the portal open so that they can see what is happening outside. Kyungo said yes. He thought he launched a stack of discs and even called a war machine. What kind of power is this? Or is he hallucinating? After a while, the huge orc appeared again, but a large stack of discs immediately flew into him, and they scattered to the sides. Kyungo looked out of the portal and asked, what is this? He looked out the window of the car behind which the portal was opened and thought. He thought that he imagined all this. But no. It's real. It shoots heavy objects at high speed, hitting monsters. And it can shoot up to 4 times per second, and in any direction. In addition, it easily restores the number of discs. And even extracts magic stones from killed monsters. And truly incredible power. Kyungo was sticking out of the portal and looking out the window. Yongsu said, from the Pampa Bridge to the 𝐿 Bridge will not work either. He began to slow down in front of the cliff of the bridge, and the protagonist turned around and said, he said that they would arrive quickly, although they still need a little time. One way or another, they can find another way there. Kyungo began waving his hands and said, only an hour has passed, so they are not late anywhere. As a person they are helping, he is simply grateful. Well, he will return to subspace. The protagonist replied, okay, and then they go on. Kyungo climbed back and thought, an hour, that's the time it took to get from Gangnam to the Pampa Bridge. Considering that they had to drive on a broken road and fight monsters. It's very fast. Perhaps 𝐥𝐸𝐲's abilities played a role in making this wonderful hour possible. Yongsu smiled and said, the road is just terrible. Kyungo thought about it, but the abilities of the person sitting behind the wheel are the most incredible. Yongsu drove quickly along the road on one side, and it was clear from his face that he was excited. Kyungo thought about it. His driving skills are so excellent that he got carsick just from looking at them. When he saw his driving style, he almost spat out what he just ate. Kyungo sat at the table, folded his hands and thought, this time he was glad that he came back before he got carsick. Both of their abilities are incredible. The protagonist sat in the front seat and looked at the road in surprise. Yongsu said, you can drive here. 𝐥𝐸𝐲 answered yes, however. He looked out the window and saw a big stone wall and said, there is something like a wall there, and they can't drive through it with a car. Yongsu said, yeah, it is pretty big. Since they can see it from here. The protagonist said, it is so high that he is not sure if they can destroy it. But first they need to get to it. Yongsu said, if they go that way, they will have to go through Yongsan. 𝐥𝐸𝐲 said, well, since they are passing by anyway, they will drop him off there. Yongsu said, okay. Kyungo frowned and thought, what is this? After a while, the guys drove him to his destination and he got out of the car. Kyungo said, thank you, thanks to them, he was able to reach his destination safely. The protagonist looked out and said, he hopes that everything will be resolved safely, may he be healthy. Kyungo bowed and said, thank you. 𝐥𝐸𝐲 smiled and looked at the system window and said, well then, all they can do now is go to Yulejiro. He had seen the wall before and it looked tall and strong, but he couldn't just level up and put the whole wall in the subspace. The system window said that there were 427 points left to level up out of 1,000. The protagonist said, it's not working. He thought about it. The remaining upgrade item is the second level of delivery tracking, and it costs 50 stones. And he collected 400 of them in an hour, but if he spends 2 more hours, he can level up. Yongsu interrupted his thoughts and said, well? Kyungo leaned towards the window and asked if they both wanted to go with him. The government provides magical stones to awakened ones and supports their early growth. If the two of them became subordinates of the government, they would definitely receive more support. 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐻 smiled and thanked him for the offer, but his family comes first to him. And they can get the magical stones themselves. 𝐘𝐢𝐝 replied, he understood. The protagonist looked out and said, but if it's the Joint Chiefs of Staff, they should have 1 or 2 helicopters, right? 𝐘𝐢𝐝 asked again, a helicopter? He replied in surprise, there is, yes. So what? After a while, 𝐷𝐸𝐽 stood next to a large map and thought, Gwacheon and Anyang seem to have flown away. The 56th Division too. Is the 1st Corps the only place where everything is properly staffed? He looked at the map and wondered, can they really say that the government still exists despite the circumstances? The situation was getting grimmer with each passing hour. At that moment, a military man entered the office and said, Chief, there is someone here, he thinks he should meet him. 𝐷𝐸𝐽 asked who? The military man folded his hands behind his back and replied, the only survivor of the Corps. The commander of the 50th National Defense Information Corps. He has some news to tell him. 𝐷𝐸𝐽 frowned and asked again, Commander of the 50th National Defense Information Corps? Is that true? After a while, he met 𝐘𝐢𝐝 and put his hand to his head, saluting. 𝐘𝐢𝐝 reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and showed a paper, which made 𝐷𝐸𝐽's face freeze in horror. They talked to each other for a long time, and then 𝐷𝐸𝐽 walked to the window and looked at the military vehicle. After a while, 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐻 and Yongsu got out of the car, and 𝐷𝐸𝐽 said he had heard of them. He bowed and said, thank you very much for your help, they have done a great job for the country. The protagonist waved his hands and said they were just helping Mr. Han 𝐘𝐢𝐝. 𝐷𝐸𝐽 spoke up, he told him about his abilities, and also conveyed a request. He said that he would like to exchange a helicopter for supplies and food. 𝐷𝐸𝐽 spread his arms in different directions and said, helicopters are an important strategic asset, but given his abilities, it is quite possible to do so. There is just one condition. He would like him to become a soldier. 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐻 remained silent in response, and 𝐷𝐸𝐽 said, as they know, the government is having a hard time dealing with the current situation. However, if they join their army, perhaps there will be a way to fix everything. The protagonist shook his head and replied, he is sorry, but it will not be easy. The only thing that matters to him now is to save his family. 𝐷𝐸𝐽 frowned and said, the decision is good. He looked down and said, although it will be difficult for him to provide them with a helicopter. 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐻 replied, he understands, well, he will not do anything. He started to get into the car and said he hoped the situation would improve as soon as possible, and they could all return to normal life. Until then, may they be healthy. Well, that's it. 𝐷𝐸𝐽 made a puzzled face and thought, is that a no? The protagonist reached for his seat belt and thought, well, since helicopters were hard to come by, he couldn't do anything. He looked towards Yongsu and said, they're leaving? He thought, anyway, they hadn't even properly inspected the wall yet. Suddenly, 𝐷𝐸𝐽 knocked on the window and cleared his throat and said, he had a favor to ask of him. If they helped him with this, he would provide them with a helicopter. After a while, a convoy of military vehicles was driving down the road, and the protagonist was sitting inside, sipping juice from a straw. He recalled the conversation with 𝐷𝐸𝐽. 𝐥𝐸𝐝 asked, is there another favor? 𝐷𝐸𝐽 replied, yes, the place where they last gathered reserve forces was the Seoul train station. They are still in contact with them. The problem is that the road is blocked by skeletons. The protagonist asked again, skeletons? 𝐷𝐸𝐽 answered, yes. They are not monsters that pose a threat in terms of combat power. But they are monsters that are very annoying. Not only are there many of them, they have a core at the bottom of their right ribcage. If it is not destroyed, they will continue to respawn. The protagonist currently looked at the skeletons with glowing eyes and remembered his question. Does he want him to destroy the skeletons and help the isolated awakened ones get out? He fired a huge projectile of discs and said, easy as pie. The bones of this one shattered and flew in all directions. The military looked at this in surprise, their eyes wide and their mouths open. The military looked out of the windows of the building and with tears in their eyes, they screamed in joy. 𝐷𝐸𝐽 gave a thumbs up from the car towards the protagonist and Yongsu. The column of military vehicles gathered all the soldiers and turned around and went back. 𝐥𝐸𝐽 looked out the window and remembered 𝐷𝐸𝐽's words, of course, with such abilities, he should be able to deal with the skeletons easily. They fought them with weapons, and they could hardly reach the cores. However, there is something he should know. Not very often, but there are unusual skeletons. They call such skeleton knights. If they accidentally encounter one, let them try to avoid fighting as much as possible. They must retreat unconditionally, no matter how much damage they cause to this knight. At this time, the protagonist saw a skeleton and fired his projectile at it. It put its hand forward, and 𝐥𝐸𝐲 remembered 𝐷𝐸𝐲's words, "Attacks do not work on such." The victims looked out from the back of the car, and the military widened their eyes. The protagonist looked forward and sighed in confusion. The skeleton knight took out a shield and began to chant. 𝐥𝐸𝐲 looked at it and asked, "The language of skeletons?" The monster stuck his sword into the ground and clutched a crystal in his hand, which began to shine. He froze and then said, "Nice to meet you, an alien from another world. He is 𝐷𝐸𝐲, one of the 12 knights who serve the king." The protagonist looked at him and said, "He broke the magic stone and spoke their language. Is it possible to use it like this?" 𝐷𝐸𝐲 turned around and said, "It was quite an interesting greeting. Is he a human mage? Why are they invading their territory?" He understands their impatience since they are in their early stages of development, but there is still something called mutual morality. 𝐷𝐸𝐲 swung his sword and threw it forward. He said, "It is useless. Something so weak can only hurt." At that moment, a pillar of discs flew at him. 𝐷𝐸𝐲 fell, and stuck his sword into the ground, slid on. He asked, "Is that his answer?" More stacks of weight discs were sent towards 𝐷𝐸𝐲, and he started throwing them in different directions. He swung his shield and rushed forward. 𝐸𝐿 screamed in fear, "𝐥𝐸𝐲! He's coming here!" The protagonist frowned and said, "He's slicing these 500 kilograms as if it were soft tofu." He thought about it though. If he hit something round, it wouldn't take any damage and would just bounce off. That's what he should throw at him. If so. 𝐥𝐸𝐲 opened the system window, which said, "Use 50 magic stones to unlock the track delivery." The protagonist opened a portal and screamed, "The delivery should be right in the chest." 𝐷𝐸𝐲 ran forward and screamed, "Didn't he get it? He's pretty stupid for someone who uses magic. He can just dodge some of these things." Suddenly, a huge pillar of discs flew into his body and he screamed. 𝐷𝐸𝐲 said not to be so cocky. He just relaxed for a second. At that moment, a bowling ball flew out of the portal and 𝐷𝐸𝐲 thought, "What?" Now he was not at all. A ball flew into his head, when suddenly another one flew straight to the target. 𝐷𝐸𝐲's body glowed with a bright light, and several new balls flew out of the portal. The protagonist said, "Left side of the head, back of the head, front of the head, top of the head, right side of the head, top of the head, back of the head, left side of the head, front of the head." He tried to explain the position of the strikes and 𝐸𝐿 asked puzzledly, "𝐥𝐸𝐲, what did he say at the end?" The protagonist said, "Let him automatically send it in that order." Pax said, "Yes, okay." 𝐥𝐸𝐲 sighed and said, he thought his jaw would fall off. 𝐸𝐿 widened his eyes in surprise and said, although it was hard, he was glad that the physical impact went away on its own. He felt so relieved, like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. He survived thanks to him. The protagonist squeezed his cheeks and said, "But this is not the end. This knight, since he is wearing armor, he is much stronger than a giant wyvern. And he is armed with a shield and a sword, so frankly speaking, he is more dangerous than a giant wyvern." 𝐷𝐸𝐲 began to shake his head and said to wait, let them just say. 𝐥𝐸𝐲 said, "Right now he forced him to shake his head like this, but he does not know how long it will take." 𝐷𝐸𝐲's skull began to crack, and the protagonist looked towards 𝐸𝐿 and said, "While he is busy, we need to send people." 𝐸𝐿 said, "Okay." He looked ahead in confusion, and 𝐷𝐸𝐲 screamed, "He is so terrible, let him stop, now." 𝐸𝐿 asked if it was just his imagination or if there was more debris flying around than before. 𝐥𝐸𝐲 answered, "Yes, that's true." He was thinking then. He spoke, "The disc stacks are sent out so that they can hit the left, right, front and back at the same time." Several pillars flew out of the portal and flew into 𝐷𝐸𝐲, and his body parts were scattered in different directions. His skull flew to the other side and his voice rang out, "Unbelievable, a mage. But let him not think that this is the end. They will not die even if they fall apart. All for the king." Stones fell out of 𝐷𝐸𝐲's body and began to be drawn into the portal. The system window reported, he acquired a fragment of a large magic stone in the size of 2 pieces and a strengthening stone. The military widened their eyes in surprise and said, "They can't believe it. He defeated the skeleton knight. A knight who withstood several shots from a tank?" The military frowned and said, "Him." The guy got out of the car and shouted happily, "𝐥𝐸𝐲 defeated the knight. He defeated him." After a while, 𝐷𝐸𝐲 frowned and said he told him to retreat unconditionally if he ran into the skeleton knight. But he defeated him. I can't even believe it. He put his hand on his heart and said, the two of them, please let them go with them. The protagonist said, no, family first. 𝐸𝐴 said, then after he saves his family, let them think about it. 𝐥𝐴𝐲 said, okay. 𝐸𝐴 said, when they see all their family members, please let them think about it again in a positive way. He said to understand that they already consider them a reliable ally. The protagonist said, yes. 𝐸𝐴 said, okay, then he will lead them to the helicopter here. 𝐥𝐴𝐲 thought about it. It seems burdensome because they seem to have high expectations. Of course he knew he had defeated the one they thought was invincible. But still, somehow, if there were two knights there, they would have smashed everything. There is no doubt about that. The biggest problem is that there are at least 11 more. He followed the commander up and thought, since he called himself one of the king's 12 knights, the king is even stronger, right? Even the carefully prepared heavy projectiles didn't do much damage. On the other hand, the impact of the bowling ball cracked his armor. A bowling ball is stronger than a heavy projectile? This doesn't make sense. Where are the laws of physics? 𝐥𝐴𝐲 continued to follow the commander, climbing up flight after flight, and thought, no, if you think about it, the monster itself doesn't make sense. 𝐸𝐴𝐲 said, by the way, he received news from Lieutenant Colonel Han Kyung-go. He said that he is going to Yeoljiro, right? The protagonist looked at him and said, oh yeah, that's right. 𝐸𝐴𝐲 asked, did they know that a high wall appeared in Yeoljiro? Their military went there to scout. He turned around and said, they have lost contact with them now. Since then, they have been conducting aerial reconnaissance of the inside of the wall from time to time. Luckily, human activity is confirmed inside. The unit members are safe there, so his family members are fine. 𝐥𝐴𝐲 said, thanks for the words. He imagined his sister and thought, he wasn't really worried. His sister can humiliate any monster. 𝐸𝐴𝐲 went up and said, oh yeah. They recently discovered something unusual. The top of the wall that grew up is gradually tapering, as if it were forming a roof. They don't know if it will be completely enclosed, but luckily, he can lend them a helicopter while everything is in motion. He opened the door and said, well, here it is. The protagonist looked after him, and then saw the downed helicopter. He wondered, will it even fly? And if it doesn't fall apart when it takes off, it will be an incredible miracle. 𝐸𝐴𝐲 pointed his hand in the other direction and said, he's looking in the wrong direction. He said, his helicopter is over there. On the other side was a new helicopter, which 𝐥𝐴𝐲 looked at with surprise. Yongsu smiled and shouted, cool. 𝐸𝐴𝐲 smiled and said, this is the helicopter he will borrow, and since he is lending it to the two of them, it must be at least this good. It is not for nothing that he says that the two of them are reliable allies. Yongsu said, that is true. The Black Hawk, this is a helicopter that he would not dare to fly even if it was slightly worse in quality. But since he is borrowing the Black Hawk, he is touched. He is already looking forward to sitting at it. 𝐸𝐴𝐲 asked, he was just about to ask who will be flying it, but Mr. Yongsu, has he flown a helicopter before? He seems to know a lot about helicopters. Yongsu answered, no, this will be his first time. But he looked at the system window and said, it says here that he will be able to fly it with the help of 50 magic stones. The system window reported best driver. Unlocking a new vehicle. He can unlock the ability to drive a helicopter with 50 magic stones. Yongsu looked at it carefully and said, his ability is called best driver, helps with any vehicle. When he levels up, he is asked to register. The protagonist asked again, register? Yongsu answered yes. He thinks that he can get behind the wheel by registering, even if he has never driven this vehicle before. It seems that it is not about leveling up, but about getting a registration to drive. 𝐥𝐴𝐲 wondered, that's why there was no message asking to level up. Yongsu said, that's strange. Since it is not about leveling up. 𝐸𝐴𝐲 asked to wait a minute. Magic stones, will they follow him? He walked towards the large helicopter, and the guys looked after him with puzzled eyes. 𝐸𝐴𝐲 opened the case, which contained shimmering magic stones, and the protagonist asked, is this? 𝐸𝐴𝐲 pointed at it with his hands and said, 200 magic stones. This is a gift from their army for the two of them. They originally wanted to surprise them when they boarded, but he thought it would be better to give it to them right away. 𝐥𝐴𝐲 sighed and thanked him. Yongsu said, thank them? The protagonist looked at 𝐸𝐴𝐲 and thought, such a powerful attraction. Yongsu leaned over the case and said, he only needed 50, so he could use the rest as he saw fit. The system window reported 50 magic stones used to improve the helicopter's control ability. Yongsu let out a loud cry, which worried the protagonist. He said with ominous joy, "He knows how to drive this machine." "They're leaving now." 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐬𝐿 looked at him carefully and said, "It's good that they can fly, but his expression is a little scary. Should we leave calmly?" Yongsu interrupted him and said, "No." After a while, they boarded the helicopter and Yongsu began to look around in admiration, and the protagonist began to cry. Yongsu said happily, there was still some time before departure. He could prepare himself mentally later. He would let him know once they set off. 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐬𝐿 looked at how quickly Yongsu was moving his hands, adjusting the equipment, and thought he didn't know what was going on, but it seemed like he was busy. It was awkward to sit back. He would look at what he had for now. He opened the system window, where it was written, large magic stone, 2 pieces, strengthening stone 1 piece. Each large magic stone is equivalent to 100 magic stones. He needed to transform the 2 large magic stones he had into 200 magic stones, and the total number of magic stones he had would be 1393. The protagonist looked at this in surprise and thought he had killed many skeletons on the way back and forth from the rescue mission, but he didn't know there were that many. He needed to level up immediately. The system window reported he could use 1,000 magic stones to level up the subspace. Process 3%. He can use his abilities when he levels up. 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐬𝐿 looked at the maroon stone and thought about where he should use this thing. The system window said, D-level enhancement stone. Properties: fire. Options: penetration, ignition. Enhancement stones have the same source as normal magic stones, but have additional properties. When using the awakened system, they can use enhancement stones to give objects certain properties. The magic stone he has the fire property. The protagonist thought about it, so let's summarize. An enhancement stone, unlike a normal magic stone, attaches to an object and enhances its properties. He imagined a skeleton knight and thought about it, in short. This stone gives objects the same fire property that the skeleton knight had. The important thing is that he doesn't know how much it will be enhanced. 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐬𝐿 clicked on the system window where it said, items that can be enhanced. A stack of discs, a grenade? He said, he's going to take this into account and enhance it. The system window reported, the enhancement is complete, fireball. Spinning bowling ball, plus 1 point. Class is rare. Description, failed to get the information. He can enter his own description. Property: fire. Options: penetration, ignition. PAX reported, he can re-register this product. Does he want to register it? The protagonist replied, yes, please let it register. He thought, when he fought the skeleton knight, the strongest hit for him was made by the bowling ball attack. So for now, he will enhance this. Yongsu said, well, they are leaving. Let him hold on tight. 𝐥𝐸𝐿 was puzzled and remained silent in response. The helicopter moved forward, and 𝐷𝐸𝐿 saluted and said he hopes that he will save his own and return safely. The protagonist gave a thumbs up and looked at the system window, where it was written, the level up is complete. There are new items that can be opened and additional items that can be enhanced. New, now people who have registered item returns in the subspace can do so too. New, now he can temporarily increase the standard shipping limit for each item using magic stones. New items that can be opened. 𝐥𝐸𝐿 looked at this in surprise and widened his eyes. 𝐷𝐸𝐿 stood still and looked at the helicopter and thought, the rotor had already spun up enough. It looks like they are about to take off. When they return, he should think about joining the military. He even gave them magic stones for the Black Hawk, but he will talk to him again when they return. However, what is with his expression? 𝐷𝐸𝐿 looked at the frightened protagonist and thought, did he make a mistake? The system window reported, openable items, cost 250. Subspace laboratories, he can use the conversion function. Subspace life support system, a weak healing effect is provided inside the subspace. Product registration in a category, he can register objects from outside that match the category in the subspace. However, there is a separate registration fee, determined depending on the value, size, weight of the item. It must be admitted that the biggest drawback of the subspace ability is that it only has one purpose. It is used to store objects such as a logistics center or a military unit. But it is difficult to save things that are not registered in the category. However, it can register new items in the subspace if the category remains the same. The system window reported that it can only register items that match the 2 currently registered categories, logistics center and military unit. 𝐥𝐸𝐿 looked around and thought, military unit, the helicopter he is currently flying is military. The system window reported that the UH-60 Black Hawk belongs to the military unit category and can be registered. The registration fee is 107 magic stones. Sankyo walked back, and then thoughtfully turned around and looked at the helicopter. He wondered why the two came back. Is there something wrong with the helicopter? A portal opened and a helicopter entered, and then came out and several more appeared. The protagonist waved and the helicopter began to gain altitude. Sankyo looked around and froze in surprise. At this time, in the city that was hidden behind a huge wall, in a large castle with a red light, a skeleton was sitting and thinking. He thought, no matter how much he thought about it, he could not understand. The initial level of the Earth dimension, it is only the 8th. And in order for a high-level being to come here, they must lower their level, like he did. This wizard, known for his arrogance, risked lowering his level to come here. And on top of that, he came all the way to where he lives and killed Gwaine? A spirit appeared next to him and said, according to what Gwaine told him before he died, he tried to talk to the magician, but he immediately attacked him. He must be dangerous. If he gave the spirit the order, he, Lancelot, would cut off the wizard's head and give it to him, the king. The king said there was only one reason why a high-ranking being had come here. He, like him, was determined to take the initiative before the discovery became a full-scale one. In that case, Lancelot, it would be best to eliminate him, as he had said. However, it had happened outside the castle anyway. So there was no need for murder. What they had to think about was the harvest. It was a pity that Gwaine had been hurt, but they could get the strengthening stone again. It was almost finished. The king put his hand to his head and said that as soon as the harvest was over, he would go straight to the wizard. Lancelot said, yes, my lord. But it seemed that people had broken into the castle. The king said it must be that crazy toy again. Let him leave it alone, it would soon go crazy anyway. Just another meal for Camelot. It turned into a bat, and its body was pierced. At this time, the helicopter was flying in the sky, and the protagonist looked out the window and thought, apparently it has greater destructive power than a stack of discs. If so, then why didn't he just strengthen the stack of discs? 𝐤𝐸 looked ahead and said, 𝐥𝐸𝐲, they've almost reached the place. Landing right now will be difficult. The protagonist sighed and said, if he has trouble finding a place to land, he'll just do an item return. 𝐤𝐸 looked in the mirror and said, no, it's not that. There's a skeleton knight fighting another monster. At this time, the skeleton knight ran forward, swinging his sword. A girl was fighting against the skeleton. 𝐥𝐸𝐲 frowned and looked at the battle with a puzzled look. Soul clenched her fist and punched Lionel in the chest, causing him to fly forward and burst from the fall. 𝐤𝐸 said, both are great. If they sit down now, they might have to deal with those two monsters. The protagonist asked, yes, 𝐤𝐸, do he think they look like monsters? 𝐤𝐸 replied, yes, of course. The protagonist said, it's his own sister. 𝐤𝐸 widened his eyes and asked, who? 𝐥𝐸𝐲 looked towards the girl's silhouette and said, the monster that just blew up the skeleton knight. Soul clenched her fist and said, that's weird. She definitely had a feeling, but why is he still alive after hitting him? The protagonist remembered a moment when Soul was sitting in front of the TV watching a fight. A mixed martial arts match that she accidentally saw on TV when she was a child. Kim's Soul watched and couldn't tear herself away. How timely, she had a younger brother. 𝐥𝐸𝐲 walked up to her and asked his little sister to play with him. Soul smiled and replied, yeah? She punched him a few times, and after he fell to the floor unconscious, she said, that's weird. Soul scratched her head and said, all those matches she watched usually didn't end so quickly. Kim Soul won, but she didn't feel like a winner. Winning over a weaker opponent was not the victory Kim Soul wanted. She went to the playground to find worthy fighters. However, even the neighborhood kids who were 3 years older were inferior to Kim Soul. Her father saw her talent. 𝐥𝐸𝐲 remembered his sister's first defeat. Soul knew the pain of defeat, but she was by no means weak. Soul lay in the corner and thought, this is fun. The spirit of competition. Natural physique and undying passion. With incredible talent, she studied various martial arts, boxing, kickboxing, jiu-jitsu and so on, and won awards in competitions. By her first year of middle school, Kim Soul had no rivals at her rank. With undying passion, she trained without sparing herself, and eventually, her addiction to exercise, which was at the level of obsession, escalated to a serious level. And as a result, she suffered an injury that tore both of her cruciate ligaments. But Kim Soul resumed training because the injuries took too long to heal, as she said. The protagonist remembered Seoul with a cast on her leg and in a wheelchair. This only added to her new injuries of varying severity. And then she suffered another injury from training before the previous wounds had time to heal. And as a result, 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐿 said, last year, Kim Seoul debuted at the age of 24. Yongsoo looked at him questioningly, and the protagonist said, her skills allowed her to debut much earlier. First, could he please slowly start to descend so that he can throw the bowling ball? Yongsoo frowned and replied yes. He thought, does she really look like a monster? The protagonist threw the ball down, and the skeleton said, he will ask one question. Why are his attacks not hitting? Seoul looked at him puzzled and asked, is he asking because he doesn't know? Is it because he is slow? Lionel answered, no. He is not as slow as the other guys. It is not a matter of speed, rather, the technique of execution. She definitely has some technique. Seoul asked, technique? No, nothing like that. Just the position of the shoulders, waist and feet. Lionel stood still and said, actually, the most important thing is the basics. He is learning something new. Honestly, if it weren't for the hierarchy, he would have lost. Someone like her is not that common. Soon, if she raises her rank, she can become the best knight. Seoul frowned and asked, what? Lionel answered, so he will let her go. There is not much time left. If she does not leave the castle, her death will be inevitable. He will talk to the King of Knights and let her go. Normally, this would be impossible. Suddenly, his body exploded and he said, but he gives her a little respect for teaching him the importance of the basics. His body parts flew in different directions, and a burning bowling ball fell on the asphalt. Seoul frowned and asked, a bowling ball? The bowling ball broke it. But she did not succeed. Stones fell from the knight's body and began to rise up into the portal. Seoul narrowed her eyes and looked at it questioningly. The helicopter began to descend and stopped the valves after landing. 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐿 came out of the cabin and smirked and said, long time no see. As expected, she is alive and well, the second. Seoul widened her eyes in surprise and asked, the third? After a while, various goodies were lying on the table in the subspace. Juyeon looked away and said, so her ability creates a transparent barrier, and while it is active, her physical abilities increase? Seoul ate and frowned and replied, it has nothing to do with the barrier. Juyeon asked her to please eat slowly, otherwise she will get sick. The protagonist spoke, she is still the same. In any case, they are lucky that all three of them awakened their abilities and survived. Now they can go to where they are. Seoul interrupted him and asked if he can hear, but why is he the only one cheating? Why is this happening? 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐿 replied, it would take too long to explain. First, she needs to eat and rest. If she needs anything, let her ask Pax. And she should say hello to the Yongsoo family, who is in this subspace. Seoul replied, okay. Juyeon looked at the protagonist and asked, is he leaving already? He stood up and said he has to. The castle ceiling will be closed soon. Juyeon asked, is this the wall that Song Hyun-gu was talking about? She heard that it was growing, but she didn't know that it was trying to create a ceiling. 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐿 turned around and said, when he brought the second one, the sky was almost impossible to see. So we need to hurry. He also wanted to collect a couple more magic stones, so we need to run before the ceiling completely closes. At that moment, 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐿 came out of the portal and looked up, seeing the wall above his head collapse. He asked, what is this, why is it so dark? The protagonist looked at it in surprise, and then got into the helicopter with Yongsoo and started hitting the burning balls. It hit the wall, but it didn't leave a mark on it. The protagonist thought in surprise, even after such an attack, there is not a scratch on it at all? It is unlikely that it will open again. Should he just put this place in the subspace? No, he needed to think about it again. The system window said that depending on the product, he could temporarily increase the standard limit for stone delivery. He needed to use 15 magic stones to increase the standard flight range of the Black Hawk to 20 meters. The number of magic stones he had, 36. 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐿 looked at this and thought, but even without that, he had used up all the magic stones to increase the delivery standards just to give helicopters to the military. Now it would be harder and harder to raise his level. From now on, every time he sent out a helicopter, there would be 15 of them. He didn't even know if a castle of this size would fit. What if not just the castle but the entire Yujiro fit in here? At that moment, Seoul peeked out from the portal and the protagonist turned around in surprise. Seoul asked, was what he said really true? 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐿 asked him. Seoul answered, the skull he had broken. That guy said she would die if she stayed here, so he would spare her. The protagonist turned around and asked, "Die how?" Seoul looked at him and replied, "She doesn't know how. He just said he would talk to the King of Knights or something to spare her." 𝐥𝐸𝐽 asked, "Right?" Seoul continued speaking, "Then he died from a bowling ball he threw." The protagonist spoke, "King of Knights, that guy knows what to do. The problem is, they don't have much time. And when, let them say for mercy, they are looking for the king's knight in 𝐥𝐸𝐽. Yongsu told them not to worry. 5 minutes, they only need 5 minutes. 𝐥𝐸𝐽 ordered to wait, "Please calm down." Yongsu happily began to steer, moving forward. At that moment, the king asked, "Lionel died, and without even hitting her?" Lancelot answered, "Right." The king asked, "But could this be the work of a mage?" Lancelot replied, "Lionel simply put it before him, and that was it. But he thinks it is really a mage." The king clenched his fist and said, "The harvest is just around the corner, and he is interfering like this. He had planned to interfere with his harvest from the beginning. If that was the case, there was no need to wait." "Where are they now?" Lancelot replied, "He did not need to move himself. They were already approaching." The king asked again, "Were they coming towards them themselves?" He looked out the window where he saw a helicopter approaching the castle. The king looked at the helicopter where the main character was sitting and thought in surprise, "Undead? Didn't they say it was a mage?" Whoever it was, he saved him the trouble of looking for it since he came to the castle alone. No, maybe he didn't need to go that far. They could be taken out by those guys. He looked ahead where he saw bats hanging upside down. After a while, the gate opened and 𝐥𝐸𝐽 screamed loudly. He was feeling sick and saying he would never fly a helicopter again. His vestibular system couldn't handle it. Suddenly he heard a loud scream and saw a huge bat with big fangs in front of him. At that moment, Seoul clenched her fist and struck the creature. She quickly swung and struck with her other hand, and the protagonist managed to duck in time. The monster flew into the center of the hall, and the guys went inside. 𝐥𝐸𝐽 frowned and thanked her. Seoul held her hands in front of her and said, "No, we need to wait." She narrowed her eyes and said, "Is there something else there?" The protagonist looked at her questioningly and asked, "For example?" The monster was lying on the floor and growling, and then raised its head and many glowing red eyes appeared in the darkness. The guys looked at it in surprise, and 𝐥𝐸𝐽 said, "Yongsu. He thinks he should go to subspace." Yongsu replied, "Yes, yes." Seoul smiled and said, "Yes, this is fun." She would be upset if there was only one. She goes first, third. The protagonist asked her to wait, but Seoul had already run ahead. She pushed off the floor and jumped on the monster's head with her feet. She slammed the creature into the floor, when suddenly everyone else rushed forward. Seoul smiled and continued to hit the monsters. A monster came up behind her, but she dodged and swung her arm, throwing the creature aside. Suddenly, the creature bit Seoul's throat with its teeth, and she grabbed the bat by the ears and pulled it away. She swung and slammed the creature into the ceiling. Seoul smiled, because she finally felt like she was in the right place. The protagonist looked at her and thought, "It looks like she's having fun. But there are so many of them that he can't even get a good look. There are many enemies, but he can't stand aside. Is there a way to help her?" 𝐥𝐸𝐽 opened the system window and read there, he can use the transformation function. The monster opened its toothy mouth, and Seoul hit its head with her elbow. She looked at the creatures lying on the floor and wiped the blood from her face and said, "Next." She looked ahead questioningly, where the monsters were sitting without moving. Seoul asked, "What? Where are they all looking?" She turned around and saw a portal from which a large installation appeared. The system window reported, "Electric Mosquito Pest Repeller IIC 200+1. Class Rare, Description Unknown." He can enter his own description. Property, Electricity, Options, Shock, Penetration, Incitement. The protagonist sat in a massage chair and said contentedly, "Wow, a useful thing, he supposes." Seoul turned around and asked, "What?" "Hey, 𝐥𝐸𝐽, what is he doing?" The protagonist asked again, "How what?" "He is helping his sister." Seoul asked displeasedly, "Helping, and not the other way around? His uniform fits him just the same. It's not even wrinkled, so how does it help?" The protagonist shouted back, "Is she completely crazy? What does the uniform and its wrinkles have to do with it? Wouldn't it be better for her to deal with the creatures faster?" Seoul walked forward and answered discontentedly, "Her. Let them just look at how he addresses his older sister." They argued with each other for a while, and Tristan watched. After a while, the king said, "Tristan, is that really what he just saw?" Tristan answered, "Yes, and quite recently." In addition to the wizard who used the item, there was also a person whose abilities are on the same level as his. The king grabbed his head and sighed. He said he should have been ready to fight with all his might against one wizard, and now this person. Lancelot, he needs him. Lancelot asked, will everything be okay? The 7th level on the ground, the Chamber of Commerce will not calm down if they find out. The king answered, now I don't care. The wizard is at least level 8. Even if they were of the same rank, the wizard's strength is still higher than his. Besides, since there is someone with the same skill as the knight, they will lose by releasing the same level. Lancelot replied, he understood. The king stretched out his hand and said, Tristan, he will not forget his sacrifice. Tristan replied, he will obey his orders. The king took out the enhancement stone from his body and said to come out, the most powerful sword that serves him, Lancelot. Through Lancelot, a red light shone. At this moment, soft pipes flowed from side to side and tied on the bat. The system window reported, Electric Mosquito Pest Repeller IAC 200 Plus Baseball Bat. The class of this, semi-rare. Description unknown, he can enter his own description. Property, electricity. Options, penetration, electrification, mockery. Soul pulled it forward and said, very good. She started to twirl it in her hand and asked, is this how he used to fight insects? The protagonist replied, yes. Pax, he can do the rest himself. Pax said, okay, accept it. Soul asked, did it really get stronger? Wow. How did the lab even get there? She started to exit the portal and said, thanks for the weapon anyway. This electric baton is great for crushing skulls. 𝐥𝐸𝐽 came out with her and said, there is a nuance. When combining a strengthened item with another, the power decreases, the class decreases to semi-rare, and the stats get minus. Soul put her hand on its neck and said, anyway, even a semi-rare item is still rare. The protagonist answered, that's right. Soul said, then she'll be able to swing the bat normally. 𝐥𝐸𝐽 looked at her and asked, why is she itching? Like she was bitten by mosquitoes. Soul answered, it wasn't a mosquito. She was bitten on the neck when she was fighting that monster. Everything was fine, but after she entered and exited the subspace, she started itching. The protagonist turned around and asked fearfully, doesn't she feel like she's about to turn into a vampire or something? Although external communications are blocked in the subspace, it seems like it might be okay. Soul asked puzzledly, but what is this feeling? 𝐥𝐸𝐽 asked, well, doesn't she suddenly feel like biting others on the neck or something? Soul gripped the handle of the bat and answered, she just wants to beat him up. The protagonist answered, the usual. She's fine. Soul frowned and said, if she suddenly becomes a vampire, let him kill her. She doesn't want to become a monster. Suddenly, a voice was heard, for a famous wizard to come to such a rundown shop. The name Arcane makes him cry. The king sat on the throne and said, let him ask a question. He understands that as a famous wizard, he is becoming more and more popular. But why on earth would he interfere in other people's affairs and cause trouble? The protagonist raised his eyebrows and asked, the Night King? Soul replied, there is no need to look for him, that's good. The king said, it would be better to answer directly. Even if they came from Arcane, he is now in a situation where he has no choice. Soul put her hand on her hip and asked, Arcane what? What are they talking about? 𝐥𝐸𝐽 replied, he himself does not know. The king spoke, he was a fool for trying to talk to them. They seemed to have no intention of engaging in a dialogue. Well then, let them die here. Lancelot. Next to him stood Lancelot in steel armor. Soul smiled and said, it got cool. Great. She was just about to test how the electric baton worked. She adjusted her sleeves and turned around and said, this time there is no need to worry about her. She turned around, and Lancelot was already next to her. He swung his sword, but Soul quickly blocked the blow. The force raised dust from the carpets, and the protagonist screamed, dust. Lancelot hit the bat with his sword and a small crack appeared. Soul frowned and looked at it, and thought, a baseball bat with her powers. Lancelot hit the bat, and it broke into 2 pieces. 𝐥𝐸𝐽 asked, what is it? It should be semi-rare, but it broke in an instant. Soul said displeasedly, no. The protagonist looked at her and asked, what? Soul answered, the problem is not that the bat is fragile, it's just that he is very strong. The protagonist looked at him thoughtfully and thought, his sister rarely calls someone strong, but if she did. He said he was already out of magic stones because he was making a baseball bat for her. Would she mind pouring out some more? Soul clenched her fists and said that she didn't want to share. Lancelot looked ahead in surprise, when suddenly bowling balls were heading his way. He began to cut them with his sword, which greatly surprised 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐸𝐻. Lancelot rushed forward and cut another ball. He swung and tried to hit 𝐸𝐲, who dodged and punched him in the head. He swung, but she ducked again and hit him in the stomach and head from below. Lancelot looked to the side, when suddenly a ball hit him and he flew off. He got up and looked at the protagonist, who was surprised, thinking, the blow hit him right on the head, but he was not scratched. He has a bad feeling about this. Danger! 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐸𝐻 shouted, goods returned. 𝐸𝐲 cried out in surprise as the portal began to suck them back in. The king said, Lancelot, give chase? Lancelot replied, yes, lord. 𝐸𝐲 looked at the protagonist with displeasure and asked, did he interrupt her just to prevent her from getting the stone? 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐸𝐻 frowned and replied, no, he did not interrupt her. It's just that this thing seems a little dangerous. He looked through the portal and said, he doesn't care even if he was hit by a bowling ball. 𝐸𝐲 said, this is not someone they can handle. Suddenly, Lancelot quickly moved to the portal and pointed his sword at the protagonist. It almost passed through the portal and 𝐸𝐲 said, it is definitely dangerous. 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐸𝐻 thought, wait a minute, is that so? Lancelot froze and then began to hit the portal, trying to break it. Bowling balls started flying out of the portal, and the skeleton quickly cut it. The protagonist thought, he stops even those that just flew out in front of him? Lancelot continued to quickly cut the balls, and the king sat behind him and said, bad. They hide behind the dimensional gate, and only use items. But, it's not like he doesn't understand. If they fought each other, being on the same level, one would think that they definitely won't lose. After all, magicians are really strong. But this is arrogance, this is their mistake. Lancelot, a 7th level being, is invulnerable to their attacks. Since he summoned such a fighter, he will be sanctioned by the Chamber of Commerce. He said he has no future. He already invested all his money when he came here. If he didn't summon Lancelot, he would die and lose all his property. And since he was destined to die anyway, it would be better to be punished by the Chamber of Commerce. However, such a pitiful sight is a little disappointing. If he knew this would happen, he would not have summoned Lancelot. The king looked ahead and saw many half-burning balls. He widened his eyes and wondered when did this happen. It wasn't his skills, he was just inadequate. How many items did he have if he didn't use magic? He thoughtfully looked ahead and thought, come to think of it, why didn't he use magic? Instead of wasting such items, wouldn't it be more efficient to use magic? The protagonist and 𝐸𝐲 stood near the portal and watched as the skeleton continued to cut the balls. 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐸𝐻 wondered what to do with this skeleton knight. Strengthening and making weapons is tough. Of course, he caught a few monsters on the way here. The system window reported, Subspace Laboratory. He can use the transformation function, the required number of magic stones, 250 pieces. A device for maintaining life in the subspace. Life force must be gradually restored in the subspace. The required number of magic stones, 250 pieces. The protagonist frowned and thought, usually it takes a lot of magic stones, but maybe because the current level of the subspace is high, it has increased even more. It is a little more difficult to make weapons now. He created weapons without thinking about the consequences, so he has no magic stones left. In the end, he has to deal with enemies with what he already had. And the most powerful of these, a bowling ball. The problem is that it is of no use. Is it worth hiding in the subspace? But if he kills him in front of the portal? Suddenly, the king shouted, enough. He is not a mage, he is a human. The protagonist ordered Pax to stop for a moment. The king asked, and since he is a human, he can duplicate objects, right? He walked forward and laughed and said, right? It can't be that a mage has come to such a place. He can't believe it. Does he know how much power he has now? Lancelot, let him put away the sword. They are not mages. No, on the contrary, they are on the same side now. They will be partners. Lancelot sheathed his sword behind his back and replied, yes, lord. 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐸𝐻 looked at them puzzled and asked again, partners? 𝐸𝐲 frowned and asked, what's wrong all of a sudden? The king laughed and said, they still don't know anything. Well, where should he start explaining? Oh, right. He guessed he should tell them about this first. They met the skeleton knights on their way here, killed them, and got the boost stones, right? They can make boost stones in this castle. To be precise, this castle is called Camelot. Camelot can create boost stones on living beings in general. The protagonist wondered, they? The king said, boost stones are mainly used to boost items and increase their abilities, but are also used for items with special functions. For example, if they use one in Camelot, they can summon and use 12 knights belonging to the castle, including the 7th level knight, Lancelot, who is right in front of them. 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐻𝐻's eyes widened and he looked at the knight carefully. The king said that the important thing was that the strengthening stone was a valuable commodity. But it could copy objects. What if they worked together and made copies of the stones? He laughed loudly and said that no one would offer him such a thing. Of course, it might take some time at first. But due to the nature of this item, which absorbed the living beings in the castle, to create the strengthening stone, one would have to be patient. But once the strengthening stone was made, he could guarantee that everything would go smoothly. And not only that. If they approached these guys later and asked them to make something for them. The protagonist interrupted him and rubbed his eye and said, "The King of Knights? This is his idea of cooperation. He is so grateful that he is crying. Thanks to him, everything was resolved safely. Pax, have him transfer Camelot to the subspace." The king looked at him puzzled and asked, "Where? What is this?" Suddenly, his legs caught fire and the wall collapsed and disappeared. The king began to look around and asked, "What the hell is this?" At that moment, a voice was heard from behind him. "Wow, is it so small?" Soul said, "This is really interesting." She smiled and said, "It looks like a toy." 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐻𝐻 looked at the stone in his hand and answered, "That's right." In his hand was a small castle. The king saw this and shouted angrily, "He is an idiot. He is barely level 9. How dare he steal his property?" He created a large energy ball and released monsters from it. There was a huge explosion, and then the smoke cleared and the protagonist asked, "His name is Lancelot, right?" He was standing near the portal, and 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐻𝐻 asked, "Will he kill the King of Knights?" Lancelot replied, "Yes, Lord." The king looked at it in fear and thought, "No." He asked to wait, but at that moment, Lancelot struck him. He cut the purple stone, which flew in different directions, and all that was left of the king was the crown and the burnt cloak. On the ground was a yellow sparkling stone, which Lancelot picked up. The system window reported, because the knight Lancelot was given the ownership of the Night King's dimension account. The account was also given to Lancelot's owner, 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐻𝐻. The system window reported, opening his dimension account. 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐻𝐻 account, magic stones, 3,086 pieces. Soul grabbed his shoulder and looked at the system window in surprise. The protagonist happily asked, "What is this?" Soul called out to him and pointed her thumb at herself, and said if he had any conscience he should give her 1,000 stones. She saved his life. "Have you forgotten already?" The protagonist looked at her and replied, he was grateful. But 1,000 stones, that seemed too much like extortion. Since she was so picky, he was the one who made the weapon using his stones. So they would stop at 500. Soul asked, "How could saving a life be compared to wasting stones?" 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐻𝐻 folded his arms and asked, "What? She didn't want to live in the subspace?" Soul asked displeasedly, why was he so pathetic? The protagonist asked, so they would settle for a simple thank you? Soul stretched out her hands and said, she was the one being greedy here, let him apologize. "Thank you for the 500. The protagonist frowned and said, "Right, she should be happy that he gave it to her." Soul replied, "Yeah." She looked away and said, "Well, how will he deal with this comrade?" 𝐥𝐸𝐲𝐻𝐻 looked at Lancelot, who said, "Lord." He broke the neck of the King of Knights, as he ordered. He held out the stone that fell from the king. No matter how harmless the words to explain, who would normally want to communicate with a skeleton knight? The protagonist looked to the side where the little girl was riding on Lancelot's neck and wondered if it was because she was bored in the subspace. Yongsu's daughter, Li Yuzhong, she quickly became friends with him. 𝐥𝐸𝐻 smiled and apologized. What should he do now? Their daughter is usually not like this, but Lancelot seemed to like her. Lancelot replied, helping the Lord's comrades, he helps him too. And he is just happy, honored that he can help them. Yuzhong smiled, holding Lancelot's helmet. 𝐥𝐸𝐻 said she was worried that their daughter will keep asking to play with him. Yongsu asked with tears in his eyes, "Daughter, is she tired of playing with daddy yet?" Julian said, "Look, even in the middle of the game, he supports her with his hands so that she doesn't fall and touch the knife. Who wouldn't like such a loving and considerate person? Everyone knows that he's a good person." Soul put her hand on her chin and said, "Even at his young age, he's good at fighting." The protagonist asked again, "Human? He's not from Earth, so how can he be human?" Julian said, "Yes, he can." She folded her arms and said, "Well, anyway, are they heading to the Dabong district now?" The protagonist put his hands on his hips and said, "Yeah, because that's where the house they need is." Ji-yeon said, yeah, he's really busy, but he's not planning on heading out right now, is he? Jeongeum looked at her with a puzzled look, and Ji-yeon said she hasn't seen him rest properly for the past few days. She understands that he is in a hurry, but what if he faints? It is late, so how about he go tomorrow morning when the sun rises? The male lead looked to the other side where Yongsoo was talking. Dad can also play the role of a brave knight. Yoo-jong screamed, she doesn't want to. He always plays the same way, it's boring. Jisa put her hand on her cheek and said she wouldn't like that either. Let her think of a more creative role. Jeongeum smiled and looked at them carefully. He said, well, moving around at night is dangerous. After a while, Yoo-jong fell asleep on her dad's back and he said, yes, okay. Then they will leave tomorrow at 6 in the morning. The male lead said, okay, let him rest today. Sol smiled and said, Yongsoo? Yoo-jong threw a tantrum, saying that she didn't like playing with him, but fell asleep without even noticing how he picked her up. Jeongeum smiled and said, that's right. Now. He looked at Lancelot and asked, if he wanted to rest, he should prepare a place for him to sleep, right? He held out a small castle and the system window said Camelot, class unique. Description: Palace of the Cursed Knights. It can be opened in any size he wishes. The installation cost is proportional to the size. Properties are special. Options: blood sacrifice, he can cultivate or use the life force contained in it to create a strengthening stone, random. Summon a ghost, he can summon the ghosts of Camelot. There is an appropriate fee for this. Anoint a knight, he can appoint a ghost as a knight. There is an appropriate fee for this. The protagonist thought about it. There are many interesting options, but this is what he needs to pay attention to now. The system window reported class unique. Description: Palace of the Cursed Knights. It can be set in any size he wishes. The installation cost is proportional to the size. Jeongeum reread it and thought, but it didn't say how many stones were needed for what size. He wondered, he hoped it wasn't too small. It would be nice if 12 could stay there. What if he spent 300? At that moment, the castle grew in size, filling more space, and the protagonist said, something creepy appeared in the subspace. He looked at it and asked, there were a dozen of them, could they live in it? Lancelot replied, it was no problem for them, but it was too small for him, Lord. Sol looked at it in surprise and thought, if it cost 300 magic stones, then how much did that terrible Night King spend on it? Lancelot replied, he didn't know for sure, but probably. At least tens of thousands. Sol looked at him in surprise and said, that must be how much it took to make it that big. The protagonist thought about it. Now that he thought about it, he realized that even though he had placed a Camelot of this size, there were no consequences from keeping it in the subspace. Was it because it was small to begin with? He asked, but why didn't she go to rest, sister? She was going to rest too. Sol said she had something to ask Lancelot personally. She was waiting for the right moment to say it. Lancelot, she has a request. The protagonist looked at her questioningly, and she said she had been watching him for a while now, and his swordsmanship was impressive, a little. Lancelot looked at her carefully, and Sol asked him to teach her, please. Jeongeum opened his mouth in surprise, looking at her. Lancelot replied, okay. Then will she grant him one request? That punch she used earlier. Let her teach him that. Sol smiled and cried out, boy, he has a keen eye. She has quite the intense training. Can he handle it? The protagonist folded his arms and thought, she can't wait. Sol said happily, she can teach him right now, but should they start with a simple sparring match? Lancelot replied, he was in favor. Sol laughed loudly and said, she really likes that he is full of fighting spirit. And thus, Lancelot safely became a member of their family. After a while, there were soldiers with machine guns on the street, and the protagonist looked at them in surprise. Yongsoo asked, besides them, who else decided to go? Jeongeum said, it seems a little strange. At that moment, a helicopter began to descend. The protagonist looked at it in surprise and asked, also a helicopter? Yongsoo pointed at it and said that one. Sankyo came out of the helicopter and happily said, Jeongeum is there too. The protagonist asked, is the chief of the operational headquarters Yu Sankyo? He came out of the portal and said, it's nice to see him again, sir. Sankyo replied yes. He searched for them for a long time after he saw that the Uljiro fortress wall had disappeared. Jeongeum frowned and asked, the Uljiro fortress wall had disappeared at night, and they started looking for them right then? They didn't come here to try to convince him again, did they? Sankyo started shaking his head and saying, no, no. He came to report important news. The protagonist asked again, important news? 𝐸 replied yes. They shouldn't travel by helicopter. The first corps that staged the coup d'état captured the air defense base. And they're shooting down everything that flies through the air. Yongsoo asked, puzzled, what? So the situation is as follows. After they left, the Joint Chiefs of Staff monitored the Corps' activities based on the documents and information provided by Lieutenant Colonel Han Kyung-go. The First Corps gradually expanded its influence from the Dabong area to the Songbuk and Gangbuk areas, and it was confirmed that the Loyal Corps had captured the capital's defense forces. The military sent out reconnaissance drones and troops to determine the exact number of forces. But during the investigation, the drones kept going astray. After analyzing the firing points, they were able to confirm that a powerful defense system had been set up in the area from Kukhi University to Han-O University of Foreign Studies. 𝐸 frowned and said that their military was in a difficult situation because the security there was very strict. But after thinking for a moment, he remembered that they were going to Yeongbuk, so he hurried to find them. If they went there, they would probably have to take a detour. A big detour towards Namyangju. But in reality, it was hard for him to say anything about the situation there, so he couldn't even recommend that route. The protagonist looked at him and said, thanks for telling him everything. He was thinking about them going by helicopter. 𝐸 replied, he was glad he could tell him so quickly. Jeongeum put his hand to his chin and thought, the news was even worse than he thought. 𝐸 said, by the way, the castle walls. Did they catch the King of Knights? The protagonist thought, if their goal was just to get to Yeongbuk, they could have made a detour and stopped at Namyangju like he said. But they had to go through Dabong to get to Yeongbuk. Since he said those guys had spread their influence to Dabong, then a clash with them was inevitable. Yongsoo said he didn't see it himself, but it was true that Jeongeum had solved the problem. The protagonist didn't listen to him at this point, but continued to think, the problem is that those who staged a coup d'état in this situation are in a sense more dangerous than monsters. So, that means that brother, his wife, and his parents are currently threatened not only by monsters but also by rebels? There is no time to waste. The protagonist spoke, Lancelot. 𝐸 looked at him in surprise, and Jeongeum asked, he asked if they had dealt with the King of Knights? Yes, they had. Lancelot came out of the portal and pointed his thumb at him. The protagonist said there he was, he had done it. 𝐸's eyes widened in fear and asked, a skeleton knight? The protagonist replied, he was with them now. Anyway, since his destination was in the Dabong area, clashes with the rebels were inevitable. This guy would be of great help to them. So he suggested that they come up with a plan to eliminate the rebels together. 𝐸 smiled and said, of course. He thought, wow. After a while, the monsters were standing near military installations, and behind them were large metal cages with people. Suddenly, a floating skeleton appeared in front of them and attracted the attention of the monsters. He began to say something unintelligible, and the monsters went in another direction and discussed their business. Lancelot watched them, examining the uniforms and features of the monsters. The system window reported, summoning ghosts. He can summon ghosts of Camelot for the appropriate fee. Summoning is one of the options of Camelot. The knight in the form of a ghost has no physical contact with anything, but at the same time, since nothing physically interferes with him, he can freely pass through walls or fly through the air. The cost of summoning a ghost is 1 reinforcement stone and 500 magic, which is the same as the cost of anointing a knight. Although it is not specified in the description. Even if you summon a knight in a certain form, you can change his incarnation without any additional costs. In other words, summoning a ghost can be considered the best means of reconnaissance of the current enemy camp. Therefore, their plan was for Lancelot to conduct reconnaissance of the enemy positions, determine the number of forces, the location of anti-aircraft guns, and the characteristics of the enemy, and then develop a plan to overcome them based on the information received. Since the ghost's range is limited, they approached the front line and began a reconnaissance operation at the women's university where the government troops were stationed. Lancelot finished in 2.5 hours. However, the protagonist's eyes widened in surprise and asked, were some of the soldiers' body parts turned into goblin-like ones? And they even locked people in cages and sacrificed them? How many enemies? More than 200? Will the world change when he comes? There were guys in the room, and while listening to Lancelot's story, they asked questions. Questions were heard everywhere. Is there a brigade commander at the university who is expected to be a key officer? Are they going to organize additional personnel transfer to the Banghak area? There are only 9 anti-aircraft guns there? Lancelot replied, yes, that's right. Yongsu frowned and said, that can't be. Sankyo lowered his head and folded his arms over his chest and said, he didn't think they were up to anything. And these guys even captured civilians. 𝐥𝐸𝐽 folded his arms and said, it seems like they joined the rebels of their own free will. So what is their purpose in detaining civilians? Who are the priest and him? Lancelot replied, he doesn't know who the priest and the mysterious him are, but he thinks the reason they are detaining people is to cause repulsion. 𝐥𝐸𝐽 asked again, repulsion? Lancelot replied, yes. There are ranks for all dimensional beings, and this is called hierarchy. It is the power that a given hierarchy has. Or you can say the right to protect themselves from beings below them. The lower the rank in the hierarchy, the stronger the repulsion. For example, an attack from a rank 9 will not affect an attack from a rank 8 being. Of course, as they already understood, it is not absolute. 𝐥𝐸𝐽 imagined a skeleton and thought, and that knight is a skeleton from before. Soul spread her arms in different directions and asked, so they sacrifice people to get this rank? Lancelot replied, he has no other options. However, using sacrifices to gain rank is a method that low-intelligence beings instinctively use. It's a kind of trick. And when such tricks are used by low-ranking beings, in many cases, there are deals and contacts with higher-ranking beings involved. The protagonist asked again, deals? What kind of deals? Lancelot replied, he's not sure. 𝐥𝐸𝐽 asked, does he mean that they're not just making sacrifices? The skeleton replied, yes. Soul frowned and shouted, either way, these idiots deserve to be punished. It's simple, guys. They'll go and destroy them all. The protagonist asked, if it were that simple, then why are they still here? Soul asked, what's the problem, bro? Sankyo spoke up, he thinks the important thing is that their plan is more dangerous than they think. He placed his hand on the map and said, the information that Lancelot confirmed is excellent. Just by finding out the location of the brigade commander and the anti-aircraft guns, they can tell that the success rate of the operation has increased significantly. The problem is that their defense line is much stronger than expected. Once the operation starts, they will definitely ask the First Corps for support. And if the First Corps joins in, there is a high probability that it will escalate into a full-scale war. An all-out war is dangerous since they lack intel. So they need to quickly capture them before the First Corps arrives. But in order to do it quickly, they themselves need support. An air attack using 𝐥𝐸𝐽's forces will help capture them quickly. But it is almost impossible because of the anti-aircraft guns. The protagonist replied, huh? He thought about it. No, they don't have time to wait for support. 𝐵𝐴Nghak district, this is the home of his brother's young family. So they must finish everything before they go to 𝐵𝐴Nghak. Of course, Lancelot is a level 7, so he can destroy everyone by himself, but the area is too large, so they are in trouble. Reinforcements from the First Corps will arrive, and there is a high probability that this will escalate into a full-scale war. Lancelot asked, if the problem is with the anti-aircraft guns, how about calling another knight? 𝐥𝐸𝐽 raised his hand and said, to summon a knight, they would need a booster and magic stones. Right now, they have magic stones, but no booster. Lancelot, he could cancel his summon, take the booster stone, and summon him again. But there would be no point, since it would not increase his strength anyway. Above all, he felt uneasy about having to summon another knight instead of him. If only the booster stone could be copied, but magic stones and booster stones could not be copied. Lancelot remained silent at first, and then said, by defeating the King of Knights, you can get a booster stone. The protagonist looked at him puzzledly and asked, what is he talking about? He does not remember the booster stone. He remembered and said with wide eyes after. By the way, there is a booster stone that Lancelot found. Everyone in the room turned their gaze to him. 𝐥𝐸𝐽 shyly put his hand on his neck and said, no, well, he was not the one who found it. He might have forgotten. So, who is this knight? Lancelot said, the 12 knights of Camelot, they are excellent knights with both skill and loyalty. So he will not be disappointed whoever he summons. But Bedivere seems to suit him the most. The protagonist asked again, Bedivere? Lancelot said, he is a knight who is so good at long-range attacks that he was once called the greatest archer of all time. The protagonist smiled and said, he must meet him immediately. After a while, people were sitting in a cage with sunlight shining through the bars. The monster walked up to the girl and called out to her. She looked up and asked, does he mean her? The monster replied, that's right, everyone else in this cage is in bad shape except her. Does she want to escape? The girl looked at him in surprise, and the monster said, they will not see each other again. The monster smiled and laughed, and said, if she fulfills one of his requests, then he would help her escape. Suddenly a head fell off his shoulders and he asked, well? Are you interested? The girl looked at it puzzled, and Lancelot cut off the monster's head and ran into the forest. She got out of the cage and saw a burning ball flying. The monsters looked at it and asked, what is it? The monster said, indeed. There is something flying like a bowling ball. Wait a minute. It is flying towards them. The monsters looked around and asked, what is that sound? An explosion, or is it his imagination? At that moment, an explosion occurred right behind him. Lancelot picked up the ball from the ground, and then placed it on the fabric of the slingshot and said, the next target to throw. Some time ago, he said, oh right. There is something he did not tell them. Bedivere is one-armed. The main character folded his arms across his chest and said, he is called the genius archer of the century. He shoots with only one arm? Lancelot answered, yes, a real genius. It is an old story. Long ago, Bedivere served as a knight under the command of a duke, and the commander, envious of his talent, cut off his hand. Since then, he holds a thick leather belt in his hands instead of a bow, and throws stones and spears with it. He became one of the 12 Knights of Camelot. It's a short but sad story. 𝐥𝐸𝐻 asked, no, even if that's the case, will he be able to destroy the entire craft guns? Lancelot replied, my lord, he has fought side by side with their knights for a long time. He knows all about their fighting skills. He saw the enemy camp during reconnaissance. They and Bedivere should be enough. The protagonist looked at him thoughtfully, and he said, let him tell them one thing. At this time, Lancelot swung the ball and shouted, 12 Knights of Camelot. He released the ball upward and there was a large and bright explosion. At that moment, a monster was standing at the military post and looking out the window where the explosion had appeared. He asked, what was that? Suddenly, the monster behind him fell, and he turned around and shouted, Lieutenant Pack. What was that? Lancelot entered the room and walked towards the monster in uniform. He swung his arm and said, this is not a circle that anyone can enter.